The earliest manifestations of shamanic practice emerge from the archaeological record like fragments of a vast spiritual tapestry woven across the frozen landscapes of Upper Paleolithic Europe and Asia. Between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, as anatomically modern humans spread across these continents, they carried with them not merely tools and techniques for survival, but sophisticated spiritual technologies that would fundamentally shape human consciousness for millennia to come. The caves of Lascaux, Chauvet and Altamira stand as cathedrals of this ancient spiritual world, their walls adorned with images that speak to a profound understanding of the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. Within these subterranean sanctuaries, painted figures reveal the earliest documented evidence of shamanic transformation. The famous sorcerer of Trois Frères cave in southern France, dated to approximately 15,000 years ago, depicts a human figure with the antlers of a stag, the ears of a wolf, and the tail of a horse. This composite being, dancing across the cave wall in a posture suggesting ecstatic movement, represents one of the clearest examples of the shamanic concept of spiritual transformation and animal identification. Archaeological investigations at Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic have revealed burial sites dating to 26,000 years ago that provide compelling evidence of specialized spiritual practitioners within hunter-gatherer communities. The triple burial discovered at this site includes an individual whose skeletal remains show evidence of physical deformities that, in many traditional societies, would have marked them as possessing special spiritual powers. Surrounding this central figure, archaeologists discovered an array of carved ivory figurines, ochre pigments, and perforated shells that suggest ritual use. The positioning of the bodies and the careful arrangement of grave goods indicate a sophisticated understanding of death as a spiritual transition requiring specialized knowledge to navigate. The Venus figurines scattered across European archaeological sites from this period reveal another dimension of Paleolithic spiritual practice. These carved representations, found from the Pyrenees to Siberia, display exaggerated feminine features that suggest their use in fertility rituals and goddess worship. The figurine discovered at Willendorf, Austria, with its intricate carved headdress and pronounced feminine attributes, exemplifies the sophisticated artistic and spiritual sensibilities of these early communities. The widespread distribution of similar figurines across vast geographical distances indicates shared spiritual concepts and possibly the movement of shamanic practitioners between communities. Siberian archaeological sites provide particularly rich evidence of early shamanic practice. At Malta, near Lake Baikal, excavations have revealed a 24,000-year-old site containing numerous carved figurines, including representations of mammoths, rhinoceroses, and human figures in various poses suggesting ritual dance or transformation. The discovery of bone needles and evidence of sophisticated clothing production at this site suggests that the creation of ritual garments was already an established practice among these ancient communities. The development of animistic worldviews during this period represents a fundamental shift in human consciousness. Unlike the simple tool-making and food-gathering activities that characterized earlier human societies, the Upper Paleolithic period witnessed the emergence of complex belief systems that recognized spiritual agency in all aspects of the natural world. Rivers, mountains, forests, and individual animals were understood to possess souls or spirits that required careful negotiation and respect. This worldview necessitated the development of specialized individuals capable of communicating with these spiritual entities and mediating between the human and spirit worlds. Hunter-gatherer societies of prehistoric Eurasia developed sophisticated social structures that included designated spiritual intermediaries. These individuals, recognizable in the archaeological record through their distinctive burial practices and associated artifacts, served multiple functions within their communities. They acted as healers, using their knowledge of medicinal plants and spiritual techniques to treat illness. They served as weather workers, attempting to influence natural phenomena through ritual practice. They functioned as psychopomps, guiding the souls of the deceased to their proper destinations in the afterlife. Most importantly, they maintained the delicate balance between human communities and the spiritual forces that govern their world. The role of these early shamanic practitioners extended beyond purely spiritual functions. Archaeological evidence suggests they also served as keepers of astronomical knowledge, tracking seasonal changes and celestial events that were crucial for successful hunting and gathering. The arrangement of stone circles and other megalithic structures from this period indicates sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles that required specialized knowledge to maintain and interpret. Bone flutes discovered at archaeological sites across Europe provide compelling evidence of the central role of music in early shamanic practice. The flute found at Höhlefels Cave in Germany, dating to approximately 35,000 years ago, represents one of the earliest known musical instruments. Crafted from the wing bone of a griffon vulture, this instrument produces a range of tones capable of inducing altered states of consciousness. Similar instruments discovered at sites across the Swabian Alps suggest that musical technology was rapidly disseminated among Upper Paleolithic communities, possibly through networks of shamanic practitioners. The acoustic properties of the caves where these instruments were discovered reveal sophisticated understanding of sound and its effects on human consciousness. Many painted caves exhibit remarkable acoustic characteristics, with certain chambers producing strong echoes or resonances at specific frequencies. The placement of painted images often corresponds to areas of optimal acoustic effect, suggesting that visual and auditory elements were deliberately combined to create immersive spiritual experiences. Carved figurines from this period extend beyond the famous Venus figures to include a diverse array of animal and human representations. The lion-headed figurine discovered at Höhlensteinstadel Cave in Germany, dating to approximately 32,000 years ago, stands as one of the earliest known examples of artistic representation combining human and animal characteristics. This ivory carving, standing nearly a foot tall, required hundreds of hours of skilled labour to complete, indicating the high value placed on such objects within these communities. The distribution patterns of these carved objects suggest they served multiple functions within shamanic practice. Some appear to have been personal power objects, carried by individual practitioners as sources of spiritual protection or enhancement. Others seem to have been communal ritual items, used in group ceremonies or seasonal celebrations. The wear patterns on many figurines indicate extensive handling, suggesting they were actively used rather than merely decorative objects. Ritualistic cave art depicting human-animal transformations appears with remarkable consistency across European and Asian sites. The cave paintings at Gabilot in France show human figures with animal heads engaged in what appears to be ritual dance. Similar images from Altamira depict humans with bison characteristics, while paintings from Eastern European sites show figures combining human and mammoth features. This widespread artistic tradition suggests shared shamanic concepts regarding the ability of spiritual practitioners to assume animal forms or characteristics. The technical sophistication of these cave paintings reveals advanced understanding of artistic technique and symbolic representation. The use of natural cave contours to create three-dimensional effects, the application of multiple pigment layers to achieve specific colours, and the strategic placement of images to take advantage of natural lighting all demonstrate sophisticated artistic knowledge. The pigments themselves, often requiring extensive processing and combination of materials, indicate specialized knowledge of mineral properties and chemical interactions. Archaeological evidence from burial sites reveals the use of natural psychoactive substances in early shamanic practice. Residue analysis from ceramic vessels discovered at European sites has identified traces of ergot alkaloids, suggesting the use of naturally occurring hallucinogenic compounds in ritual contexts. Similarly, the presence of certain plant remains in burial contexts indicates knowledge of psychoactive flora and their applications in spiritual practice. The emergence of rhythmic drumming as a shamanic technique is evidenced through the discovery of stretched hide fragments and bone implements that appear to have served as drumsticks. While organic materials rarely survive from this period, the positioning of certain artifacts in burial contexts suggests the presence of percussion instruments. The acoustic analysis of painted caves reveals that many chambers would have produced powerful reverberations from drumming, creating immersive soundscapes capable of inducing altered states of consciousness. Chanting and vocal techniques developed during this period as complementary practices to instrumental music. The discovery of hyoid bones in good condition at several European sites indicates that Upper Paleolithic humans possessed the anatomical capacity for complex vocalization. The acoustic properties of ritual caves suggest that vocal techniques were specifically adapted to take advantage of natural echo and resonance effects. The use of natural psychoactive substances extended beyond simple consumption to include sophisticated preparation and administration techniques. Archaeological evidence suggests knowledge of dosage control, timing of administration, and combination with other substances to achieve specific effects. The presence of specialized tools for grinding and mixing materials indicates that psychoactive substance use was a technical practice requiring specific knowledge and skill. Ancient communities developed elaborate protocols for the safe and effective use of consciousness-altering techniques. The structured nature of cave art arrangements suggests that shamanic journeys followed established patterns and were guided by experienced practitioners. The presence of what appear to be teaching scenes in some cave paintings indicates that shamanic knowledge was systematically transmitted from experienced practitioners to novices. The integration of multiple consciousness-altering techniques within single ritual contexts represents a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and spiritual experience. Archaeological evidence suggests that drumming, chanting, and psychoactive substances were often combined in carefully orchestrated ceremonies designed to produce specific spiritual effects. The complexity of these practices indicates that shamanic technique had already achieved considerable sophistication by the Upper Paleolithic period. Regional variations in shamanic practice began to emerge during this period, reflecting adaptation to local environmental conditions and cultural preferences. Arctic communities developed techniques specifically adapted to extreme cold and limited daylight, while temperate forest dwellers created practices suited to their woodland environments. These regional adaptations would eventually give rise to the diverse shamanic traditions found across Eurasia in later periods. The social organization required to support shamanic practitioners reveals the high value placed on spiritual services within Upper Paleolithic communities. The time and resources invested in creating shamanic tools and ritual spaces indicate that these activities were considered essential rather than peripheral to community survival. The evidence suggests that shamanic practitioners occupied positions of considerable respect and influence within their societies. The vast expanse of Siberia, stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, served as the crucible where shamanic practices achieved their most sophisticated and enduring forms. Within this harsh landscape of taiga forests, frozen tundra and mountain ranges, indigenous peoples developed spiritual technologies that would not only define classical shamanism, but also provide the very terminology through which the Western world would come to understand these ancient practices. The word shaman itself derives from the Tungusic term saman, used by the Evenk and related peoples of Central and Eastern Siberia to designate their spiritual practitioners. This linguistic root, possibly connected to the Sanskrit shramana, meaning ascetic or religious practitioner, entered Russian vocabulary through contact with Tungusic-speaking populations during the expansion of the Russian Empire into Siberia during the 16th and 17th centuries. Russian explorers, missionaries and ethnographers encountered these spiritual specialists among the Evenk, Nanai and other Tungusic groups, adopting their terminology to describe similar practitioners found throughout the region. The term subsequently entered German academic literature through the works of researchers studying Siberian peoples, and from there spread into broader European scholarly discourse during the 18th and 19th centuries. The cultural significance of the shaman among Tungusic peoples extended far beyond simple religious leadership. These individuals served as the primary intermediaries between the human community and the complex spiritual ecosystem that governed every aspect of existence. Unlike the hereditary priesthoods found in agricultural societies, Siberian shamans were typically called to their vocation through direct spiritual intervention, often manifesting as a profound spiritual crisis or illness that marked their selection by the spirit world. This calling, known among the Evenk as shamanhood sickness, represented the beginning of a transformative process that would fundamentally alter the individual's relationship with both physical and spiritual reality. Siberian shamanic cosmology presented a universe structured around the central axis of the world tree, a cosmic pillar that connected the multiple levels of existence and served as the primary pathway for shamanic journeys between realms. This great tree, known by various names among different Siberian peoples, the Yakut called it Al-Luk Mas, the sacred tree of life, extended its roots deep into the underworld while its branches reached into the highest heavens. The trunk of this cosmic tree passed through the middle world where humans dwelled, providing a stable connection between all levels of existence. Along its length grew various plants and animals that corresponded to different spiritual powers and served as guides or allies for shamanic practitioners during their otherworldly travels. The three-tiered universe of Siberian shamanism divided existence into distinct but interconnected realms, each populated by specific types of spiritual beings and governed by particular laws and customs. The upper world, consisting of multiple heavenly levels, housed the great sky spirits, celestial deities and the souls of powerful shamans who had achieved elevated status after death. The Buryat tradition described 17 heavenly levels, each presided over by specific Tengri or sky spirits who controlled different aspects of cosmic order. The middle world encompassed not only the physical realm of human habitation, but also the spiritual landscape that paralleled and interpenetrated material reality. Here dwelt the spirits of natural features, mountains, rivers, forests and lakes, as well as the souls of living beings and the various helper spirits that assisted shamanic practitioners in their work. The lower world, reached by descending through the roots of the world tree, contained multiple subterranean levels where dwelt the spirits of the dead chthonic deities and powerful beings associated with the earth's depths. Among the Yakut, this realm was ruled by Arsan Dualai, the lord of the underworld, who governed the souls of the deceased and controlled access to the deepest shamanic mysteries. The lower world was not conceived as a place of punishment or evil, but rather as a necessary component of the cosmic order where certain types of spiritual work could only be accomplished and specific knowledge obtained. Shamanic initiation among Siberian peoples followed remarkably consistent patterns despite the vast geographical distances and linguistic differences between various groups. The initial calling typically manifested during adolescence or early adulthood as a severe illness that defied conventional treatment. Prospective shamans experienced symptoms that included prolonged fevers, seizures, periods of unconsciousness, and vivid hallucinations in which they encountered spiritual beings who announced their selection for shamanic service. The Evenk described this process as the spirits choosing an individual, while the Yakut spoke of being grasped by the shamanic calling. During these initiatory illnesses, candidates experienced what shamanic traditions described as spiritual dismemberment and reconstruction. In their visions, they witnessed their own bodies being taken apart by spiritual beings, their bones cleaned and reassembled, and new organs installed that would enable them to perceive and interact with the spirit world. The Buryat tradition described how initiatory spirits would count the candidates' bones to ensure none were missing, replace their heart with a new one capable of spiritual sight, and install additional ribs that would serve as sources of shamanic power. These experiences, while terrifying to undergo, were understood as necessary transformations that equipped the individual with the spiritual anatomy required for shamanic work. The training period that followed initial calling could extend for many years under the guidance of experienced shamanic teachers. Among the Evenk, novice shamans learn to identify and work with their personal helper spirits, master the techniques of soul travel, and develop proficiency in the complex ritual protocols required for different types of shamanic work. This education included extensive memorization of spiritual genealogies, mythological narratives, and the proper procedures for conducting healing ceremonies, divination sessions, and soul retrieval operations. Students also learned to craft their own shamanic tools and regalia, processes that themselves required spiritual guidance and specific ritual observances. The shamanic drum occupied a central position in Siberian shamanic practice, serving simultaneously as a vehicle for spiritual travel, a map of the cosmic realms, and a repository of shamanic power. These instruments, typically constructed from reindeer hide stretched over a wooden frame, bore painted or carved symbols that depicted the shamanic cosmos and provided navigational aids for otherworldly journeys. The Sami drums of northern Scandinavia featured intricate symbolic systems that mapped the relationships between different spiritual realms, while Mongolian shamanic drums often displayed representations of the world tree complete with the various beings that inhabited its different levels. The construction of a shamanic drum required careful attention to spiritual as well as technical considerations. The wood for the frame was typically obtained from trees that had been struck by lightning or otherwise marked by spiritual significance. The hide came from animals that had been ritually hunted or sacrificed specifically for drum-making purposes. The process of assembling these components involved elaborate ceremonies in which the drum was consecrated and imbued with spiritual power. Among the Khakas people of southern Siberia, drum-making required a series of rituals extending over several months, during which the instrument gradually acquired its spiritual potency and developed its capacity to serve as a vehicle for shamanic travel. Shamanic costumes represented another crucial category of ritual equipment, serving as both protective armor for spiritual combat and symbolic representations of the shaman's spiritual anatomy. These elaborate garments, constructed from leather, fur, and fabric, were adorned with hundreds of metal ornaments that served specific spiritual functions. Iron pendants shaped like animals, tools, and human figures represented the shaman's helper spirits and sources of power. Chains and bells attached to the costume created distinctive sounds during ritual performances that were believed to attract beneficial spirits while repelling harmful entities. The Yakut shamanic costume included a leather coat decorated with iron representations of the shaman's spiritual helpers, including miniature figures of animals, birds, and anthropomorphic beings. The back of the coat often featured a large iron tree representing the world tree, while the front displayed symbols associated with the shaman's personal spiritual lineage. A distinctive iron crown or headpiece completed the ensemble, often incorporating representations of antlers or bird feathers that symbolized the shaman's ability to assume animal forms during spiritual journeys. Metal ornaments on shamanic costumes served purposes beyond mere decoration, functioning as repositories of spiritual power and tools for specific ritual operations. Iron representations of snakes provided protection against malevolent spirits, while bird figures enabled the shaman to fly during otherworldly travels. Human figures depicted the shaman's spiritual assistants, each with specialized functions in different types of shamanic work. The total weight of these metal ornaments could exceed 20 pounds, requiring considerable physical strength and endurance to wear during lengthy ritual performances. The crafting of shamanic regalia involved collaboration between the shaman and skilled metal workers who possessed specialized knowledge of spiritual symbolism and ritual requirements. Among the Buryat, blacksmiths who created shamanic ornaments were themselves considered to possess spiritual powers, as their ability to transform raw metal into sacred objects required supernatural assistance. The forging process included specific rituals and observances designed to ensure that the finished products would function effectively as spiritual tools rather than mere decorative items. Shamanic tools extended beyond drums and costumes to include a wide array of specialized implements used for different aspects of spiritual work. Staffs carved with representations of helper spirits served as focusing devices for shamanic power and symbols of the practitioner's authority. Mirrors, often imported from China or crafted locally from polished metal, functioned as windows into the spirit world and tools for divination. Knives and other cutting implements were used for ritual purposes, including the symbolic dismemberment of spiritual obstacles and the harvesting of medicinal plants according to proper spiritual protocols. The Evenk shamanic tradition included the use of anthropomorphic figurines carved from wood or bone that represented the shaman's helper spirits. These objects, known as sevens, were carefully maintained and fed with offerings of fat, blood, or other substances believed to nourish their spiritual inhabitants. During shamanic ceremonies, these figurines served as temporary vessels for spiritual beings who provided assistance in healing, divination, or other shamanic operations. The care and maintenance of these objects required specific knowledge and regular ritual attention to ensure their continued effectiveness. Sacred bundles containing collections of power objects represented another important category of shamanic equipment. These assemblages, wrapped in specially prepared hides or fabrics, contained items that had acquired spiritual significance through their association with successful shamanic operations, or their discovery under spiritually significant circumstances. Unusual stones, fossilized remains, rare minerals, and other natural objects that displayed distinctive characteristics were often incorporated into these bundles. The contents of each bundle were unique to its owner and reflected their particular spiritual relationships and sources of power. The role of animal spirits in Siberian shamanism extended far beyond simple totemism to encompass complex relationships of spiritual alliance and mutual obligation. Shamanic practitioners maintained ongoing relationships with specific animal spirits who served as guides, protectors, and sources of specialized knowledge. The bear, revered throughout Siberian cultures as a powerful spiritual being, often served as a primary helper spirit for shamans engaged in healing work or battles against malevolent forces. The reindeer, central to the subsistence economy of many Siberian peoples, provided shamanic practitioners with spiritual allies particularly suited for long-distance soul travel and navigation between cosmic realms. Bird spirits occupied especially important positions in Siberian shamanic practice due to their natural ability to move between earth and sky realms. Eagles, hawks, and other raptors served as psychopomps who could guide shamanic souls through the complex geography of the spirit world. The raven, with its intelligence and adaptability, often functioned as a messenger between shamans and distant spiritual beings. Waterfowl provided access to underwater realms and the spirits that dwelt beneath lakes and rivers. Each type of bird ally brought specific capabilities and knowledge that enhanced the shaman's effectiveness in different types of spiritual work. The acquisition of animal spirit allies typically occurred through dreams, visions, or direct encounters during shamanic journeys. These relationships required careful cultivation through regular offerings, ritual observances, and respectful treatment of the physical representatives of the spirit species. Shamans who maintained strong relationships with animal spirits often displayed behavioral characteristics associated with their allies, including dietary preferences, movement patterns, and vocal expressions that reflected their spiritual connections. The most powerful shamans were said to be capable of physical transformation into their animal forms, though such abilities were considered extremely rare and dangerous. The frozen expanse of the Arctic Circle, where winter darkness stretches for months and summer brings only brief respite from the cold, fostered shamanic traditions that developed unique characteristics in response to the extreme environmental challenges of polar regions. Among the Inuit peoples scattered across Alaska, northern Canada, and Greenland, the Angakkuit emerged as essential spiritual practitioners whose abilities meant the difference between community survival and catastrophic failure in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. The Inuit Angakkuit operated within a cosmological framework that recognized the Arctic landscape as densely populated with spiritual beings whose cooperation was essential for human survival. Unlike the more hierarchical spirit worlds of temperate regions, Arctic shamanism dealt with a complex network of spirits that inhabited every element of the polar environment. Sela, the spirit of weather and atmosphere, controlled the fierce storms that could trap hunters on the ice for days or weeks. Sedna, the powerful sea goddess dwelling beneath the ocean floor, governed the availability of seals, walruses and whales that provided the primary sustenance for Arctic communities. The spirits of individual animals possessed their own agency and could choose to offer themselves to hunters or withdraw entirely if proper spiritual protocols were not observed. The training of Angakkuit began with recognition of individuals who demonstrated unusual sensitivity to spiritual phenomena, often manifesting as the ability to predict weather changes, locate game animals, or perceive the spiritual causes of illness and misfortune. Prospective shamans underwent rigorous initiation processes that required them to survive alone on the ice for extended periods, fasting until they achieved visions that revealed their spiritual helpers and taught them the techniques necessary for shamanic work. These solitary ordeals, conducted in temperatures that could reach 60 degrees below zero, tested not only physical endurance but also the candidate's capacity to maintain consciousness and spiritual awareness under extreme duress. The most crucial function of Inuit Angakkuit involved weatherworking, the ability to influence atmospheric conditions through spiritual intervention. Arctic weather systems possessed a volatility that could transform calm conditions into life-threatening blizzards within minutes, making accurate prediction and potential influence over meteorological phenomena essential for community survival. Angakkuit developed sophisticated techniques for reading atmospheric signs that combined empirical observation with spiritual insight. They monitored cloud formations, wind patterns, animal behavior, and subtle changes in ice conditions that indicated approaching weather systems. More importantly, they maintained ongoing relationships with Sela and other atmospheric spirits that enabled them to negotiate for favorable conditions during critical periods such as hunting expeditions or seasonal migrations. The practice of weatherworking required Angakkuit to enter trance states during which their souls travelled to the realm of atmospheric spirits to conduct negotiations for specific weather conditions. These journeys involved complex diplomatic protocols, as weather spirits possessed their own agendas and could not be simply commanded to produce desired conditions. Successful weatherworking required the Angakkuit to offer appropriate compensations, which might include spiritual energy, promises of future offerings, or agreements to perform specific ritual obligations. The most skilled weather workers could allegedly calm dangerous storms, create favourable winds for kayak travel, or bring clear skies for hunting activities, though such interventions came at considerable personal cost and could not be performed frequently. Soul retrieval represented another critical function of Arctic shamanism, addressing a common spiritual diagnosis for various forms of illness and psychological disturbance. Inuit spiritual understanding recognized that human souls consisted of multiple components that could become separated from the physical body under certain circumstances. Severe trauma, prolonged illness, or encounters with malevolent spirits could cause soul loss, resulting in symptoms that included lethargy, depression, inability to concentrate, and progressive weakening that could ultimately lead to death if not treated through shamanic intervention. The process of soul retrieval required Angakuit to track the missing soul component through the spirit world, locate where it had become trapped or hidden, and negotiate for its return to the patient's body. These operations involved considerable risk, as the shaman's own soul had to travel through potentially dangerous spiritual territories while maintaining sufficient connection to their physical body to ensure safe return. Soul retrieval journeys often led Angakuit into the underwater realm of Sedna, where souls might become entangled in the sea goddess's hair, or into the Aurora Borealis, where souls could become lost among the dancing lights that represented the spirits of the deceased. The technique of soul flight enabled Angakuit to project their consciousness across vast distances to gather information, communicate with distant communities, or locate missing persons. This ability proved particularly valuable in the Arctic environment, where small groups might become separated during storms or hunting expeditions and require assistance that could only be provided if their location and condition were known. Experienced Angakuit could allegedly send their souls hundreds of miles across the ice to observe conditions in distant areas, communicate with other shamans, or guide lost travellers back to safety. Soul flight required extensive training to master safely, as the consciousness travelling outside the physical body remained vulnerable to various spiritual hazards. Malevolent entities might attempt to prevent the soul's return, or the physical body left behind required protection from spiritual intrusion during the shaman's absence. Angakuit developed elaborate techniques for securing their bodies during soul travel, including the use of protective songs, the assistance of helper spirits, and specific body positions that maintain the connection between consciousness and physical form. Communication with animal spirits formed the foundation of Arctic shamanic practice, as successful hunting required ongoing negotiation with the spiritual essence of prey animals. Inuit cosmology recognized that animals possess souls that chose whether to make themselves available to hunters based on the spiritual condition of both individual hunters and their communities. Violations of hunting taboos, failure to properly honor killed animals, or other spiritual transgressions could result in animals withdrawing their cooperation, leading to famine conditions that threatened community survival. Angakuit served as intermediaries in these crucial relationships, conducting rituals that honored animal spirits and addressed any spiritual obstacles that might prevent successful hunting. They performed ceremonies before major hunting expeditions to secure the cooperation of target species, conducted divination to determine the location of game animals, and addressed spiritual causes when hunting proved unsuccessful. The relationship between Angakuit and animal spirits required careful maintenance through regular offerings, proper treatment of animal remains, and observance of complex taboo systems that governed human-animal interactions. The spiritual geography of the Arctic presented unique challenges that shaped shamanic practice in distinctive ways. The vast expanses of ice and snow created a landscape where traditional landmarks might shift or disappear entirely, requiring shamanic practitioners to navigate using spiritual rather than purely physical reference points. The extreme seasonal variations in daylight, from months of continuous darkness to periods of midnight sun, created temporal conditions that affected spiritual practice and required adaptation of shamanic techniques to accommodate these environmental realities. The Aurora Borealis held particular significance in Arctic shamanism, understood as a manifestation of spiritual activity that provided both opportunities and dangers for shamanic practitioners. The dancing lights were interpreted as the souls of the deceased, the activities of powerful spirits, or pathways between different spiritual realms. Angakuit learned to read the patterns and colours of the aurora to predict spiritual conditions, determine auspicious times for certain rituals, and navigate during soul travel. Some traditions describe the aurora as a bridge that souls used to travel between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, making it a crucial element in shamanic work involving communication with deceased relatives or guidance of dying individuals. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia developed shamanic traditions that shared certain characteristics with Inuit practices, while displaying distinctive features adapted to their subarctic environment and semi-nomadic lifestyle centered around reindeer herding. Sami shamanism, practiced by specialists known as Noaidi, incorporated the use of distinctive oval drums decorated with intricate symbolic systems that mapped the spiritual landscape of the northern Scandinavian region. These drums, constructed from pine or birchwood, with reindeer-hide drumheads, featured painted symbols that depicted the relationships between different spiritual realms and provided navigational aids for shamanic journeys. The symbolic systems painted on Sami drums represented sophisticated cosmological maps that encoded complex information about spiritual geography, seasonal cycles, and the locations of various spiritual beings. The central area of the drum typically depicted the world tree or cosmic pillar, surrounded by representations of the sun, moon, and major constellations that served as reference points for shamanic navigation. The upper portion of the drum showed the realm of sky spirits and celestial deities, while the lower section depicted the underworld and its inhabitants. Human figures scattered across the drum surface represented different types of spiritual beings, including helper spirits, ancestor souls, and the shamanic practitioner himself. Drum divination among the Sami involved the use of a brass ring or piece of reindeer antler that was placed on the drumhead and allowed to move across the painted symbols as the drum was beaten. The path taken by this indicator object was interpreted according to complex systems of meaning that related the symbols it touched to specific questions or concerns. Skilled Noaidi could allegedly determine the location of lost reindeer, predict weather conditions, diagnose the spiritual causes of illness, and provide guidance for important decisions through careful interpretation of the indicator's movement patterns. The practice of joik, traditional Sami songs that combined vocal techniques with spiritual invocation, formed an integral component of shamanic practice throughout northern Scandinavia. Unlike conventional songs with fixed lyrics and melodies, joiks represented personalized vocal expressions that captured the spiritual essence of specific individuals, animals, places, or phenomena. Each joik was understood to contain the spiritual power of its subject, making the practice of joiking a form of shamanic technique that could invoke the presence of spiritual beings or channel their power for specific purposes. Sami shamans used joiks to call upon helper spirits, honor reindeer and other important animals, invoke the protection of ancestor spirits, and create the altered states of consciousness necessary for shamanic work. The vocal techniques involved in joiking included distinctive throat-singing methods, rhythmic breathing patterns, and tonal variations that were believed to resonate with specific spiritual frequencies. Master Noaidi possessed extensive repertoires of joiks that enabled them to work with a wide range of spiritual allies and address various types of shamanic tasks. The relationship between Sami shamanism and reindeer herding created unique characteristics that distinguished these practices from other Arctic traditions. Reindeer served not only as the economic foundation of Sami society, but also as crucial spiritual allies whose cooperation was essential for successful herding operations. Noaidi maintained ongoing relationships with the spirits of reindeer herds, conducting rituals that ensured the animals' health and productivity while protecting them from predators and disease. The seasonal migrations of reindeer herds required shamanic guidance to determine optimal routes, locate suitable grazing areas, and avoid spiritual hazards that might harm the animals. The construction and consecration of Sami shamanic drums involved elaborate ritual processes that could extend over several months. The selection of wood required spiritual guidance to identify trees that possessed appropriate spiritual characteristics. While the preparation of reindeer hide involved specific procedures designed to preserve the spiritual connection between the drum and the animal that provided its covering. The painting of symbolic systems on the completed drum required extensive knowledge of traditional iconography and its spiritual meanings, as errors in the symbolic representation could render the drum ineffective or even dangerous to use. Geographical isolation played a crucial role in preserving Arctic shamanic traditions long after similar practices had disappeared from more accessible regions. The extreme environmental conditions of polar regions created natural barriers that limited outside contact and cultural interference, allowing indigenous shamanic systems to continue developing according to their own internal logic. The scattered distribution of Arctic populations across vast distances meant that shamanic traditions evolved somewhat independently in different regions, while maintaining core characteristics that reflected adaptation to similar environmental challenges. The seasonal patterns of Arctic life created temporal rhythms that profoundly influenced shamanic practice throughout circumpolar regions. The long winter darkness provided optimal conditions for certain types of shamanic work, whereas the absence of daylight was understood to thin the barriers between physical and spiritual realms. Major shamanic ceremonies were often scheduled to coincide with the winter solstice or other significant points in the annual cycle when spiritual conditions were most favourable for intensive ritual work. The brief Arctic summer brought different opportunities and challenges for shamanic practitioners. The continuous daylight of the midnight sun created conditions that were less conducive to deep trance states, but more favourable for certain types of healing work and community rituals. The seasonal availability of specific plants and animals required shamanic practitioners to time their gathering and hunting activities according to both practical and spiritual considerations, as the spiritual potency of natural materials varied according to seasonal cycles. The preservation of Arctic shamanic traditions through oral transmission required sophisticated memory techniques and systematic training methods that ensured accurate preservation of complex ritual knowledge across generations. The absence of written records meant that shamanic practitioners had to memorize vast amounts of information, including mythological narratives, ritual procedures, symbolic systems, and the specific characteristics of numerous spiritual beings. This oral tradition created a dynamic system of knowledge preservation that allowed for gradual adaptation and evolution while maintaining essential core elements. The vast grasslands and towering mountain ranges of Central Asia provided the geographical foundation for some of the most sophisticated and enduring shamanic traditions in human history. Across the steppes that stretch from the Caspian Sea to the borders of China, nomadic peoples developed spiritual practices that were intimately connected to their mobile lifestyle. Seasonal migrations and the complex relationships between human communities and the natural world that sustained them. These traditions would prove remarkably resilient, adapting to changing political circumstances while maintaining their essential characteristics across millennia of cultural transformation. Mongolian shamanism emerged from this steppe environment as perhaps the most complex and systematized form of nomadic spiritual practice. The Mongol peoples scattered across the vast grasslands of what is now Mongolia, northern China, and southern Siberia developed a shamanic tradition that was perfectly adapted to their pastoral nomadic lifestyle. Unlike sedentary agricultural societies that developed fixed religious centres and permanent temples, Mongol shamanism was inherently portable, carried in the minds and ritual equipment of specialised practitioners who travelled with their communities across the seasonal migration routes that defined nomadic existence. The Mongol cosmological system recognised the eternal blue sky, Tengri, as the supreme spiritual force governing all existence. This sky deity was not conceived as a distant abstract divinity, but as an active presence that directly influenced earthly affairs through weather patterns, seasonal changes, and the success or failure of human endeavours. Beneath Tengri's overarching authority, the Mongol spiritual universe was populated by countless spirits associated with specific geographical features, natural phenomena, and ancestral lineages. Mountains, rivers, lakes, and even individual trees possessed their own spiritual guardians that required proper recognition and propitiation to maintain harmonious relationships between human communities and their environment. Mongol shamans, known as Bu or Udjan, depending on their gender and specialization, served as the primary intermediaries between their communities and this complex spiritual ecosystem. These practitioners underwent rigorous training that began with recognition of their calling, through spiritual signs or hereditary transmission of shamanic abilities. The training process involved extensive memorization of genealogical traditions, mythological narratives, and ritual procedures that could extend over many years under the guidance of experienced masters. Novice shamans learn to identify and work with their personal helper spirits, master the techniques of spiritual divination, and develop the skills necessary for conducting the various ceremonies that marked important transitions in nomadic life. The integration of shamanic practice with nomadic lifestyle created unique characteristics that distinguished Mongol shamanism from the traditions of sedentary peoples. Shamanic ceremonies were designed to be conducted in portable felt tents that could be quickly assembled and disassembled as communities moved across the steppes. Ritual equipment was crafted to be lightweight and durable, capable of withstanding the constant movement and harsh environmental conditions of nomadic life. The timing of major ceremonies was coordinated with seasonal migrations, ensuring that important spiritual observances coincided with the practical requirements of pastoral nomadism. Livestock protection represented one of the most crucial functions of Mongol shamanic practice, as the survival of nomadic communities depended entirely on the health and productivity of their herds. Shamans conducted elaborate rituals designed to protect horses, cattle, sheep, and goats from disease, predation, and spiritual harm. These ceremonies involved the use of protective amulets placed on individual animals, the performance of purification rituals that cleansed herds of spiritual contamination, and the invocation of guardian spirits that watched over grazing animals during their movements across the steppes. The most skilled shamans allegedly possessed the ability to locate lost animals through spiritual divination and to influence the behavior of wild predators that threatened domesticated herds. The relationship between Mongol shamans and their horses created particularly intimate spiritual bonds that reflected the central importance of these animals in nomadic culture. Horses served not only as transportation and military assets, but also as spiritual allies whose cooperation was essential for successful shamanic practice. Shamanic practitioners developed ongoing relationships with the spirits of their horses, conducting regular rituals that honored these animals and ensured their continued loyalty and effectiveness. The most powerful shamans were said to possess supernatural horses that could travel between spiritual realms, carrying their riders on otherworldly journeys that transcended the limitations of physical, space, and time. Seasonal migration ceremonies marked the major transitions in the nomadic calendar and required extensive shamanic participation to ensure successful completion of these critical movements. Before beginning spring migrations to summer pastures, shamans conducted divination rituals that determined the optimal routes, timing, and spiritual preparations necessary for safe travel. These ceremonies involved consultation with the spirits of geographical features along the migration routes, propitiation of weather deities to ensure favourable conditions, and the performance of protective rituals that shielded the community from spiritual hazards during travel. The selection of campsites required shamanic approval to ensure that temporary settlements were established in locations that possessed favourable spiritual characteristics and avoided areas inhabited by malevolent entities. The autumn return to winter quarters involved equally elaborate spiritual preparations as communities prepared for the harsh months of cold and reduced mobility that characterised steppe winters. Shamans conducted ceremonies that stockpiled spiritual protection for the winter period, established relationships with the guardian spirits of winter campsites, and performed divination to predict weather conditions and potential challenges during the coming cold season. These rituals often involved the sacrifice of animals whose meat would sustain the community during winter, while their spirits provided ongoing protection and guidance during the period of seasonal confinement. Mongol shamanic healing practices incorporated sophisticated understanding of the relationships between physical illness, spiritual disturbance, and environmental factors that affected nomadic populations. Shamanic practitioners recognized that the constant movement and exposure to harsh environmental conditions, characteristic of nomadic life, created specific types of health challenges that required specialized treatment approaches. Illnesses caused by spiritual intrusion, soul loss, or violation of taboos related to natural features encountered during migrations required different therapeutic interventions than diseases resulting from purely physical causes. The diagnostic techniques employed by Mongol shamans combined empirical observation with spiritual insight to identify the underlying causes of illness and determine appropriate treatment strategies. Shamanic practitioners examined patients for physical symptoms while simultaneously using divination techniques to identify spiritual factors that might be contributing to the condition. This holistic approach to diagnosis recognized that effective healing required addressing both the immediate physical manifestations of illness and the spiritual imbalances that had created conditions conducive to disease. Treatment methods employed by Mongol shamans included the use of medicinal plants gathered during seasonal migrations, the performance of soul retrieval ceremonies to restore missing spiritual components, and the conduct of exorcism rituals to remove malevolent spiritual influences. The portable nature of nomadic life meant that shamanic healing had to be accomplished using materials and techniques that could be employed in temporary camp settings without access to permanent ritual facilities. This constraint led to the development of highly efficient therapeutic approaches that could produce rapid results using minimal equipment and resources. The Tibetan Plateau, with its extreme altitude and harsh climate, fostered the development of Bon traditions that represented one of the most sophisticated pre-Buddhist shamanic systems in Central Asia. The Bon religion, which dominated Tibetan spiritual life before the introduction of Buddhism in the 7th century, incorporated shamanic elements that had been refined over centuries of development in the unique environment of the high Himalayas. Bon practitioners, known as Bonpo, maintained traditions that combined classical shamanic techniques with elaborate philosophical and ritual systems that rivaled the complexity of organized religions found in other regions. Bon cosmology presented a universe structured around the concept of the cosmic mountain, a sacred peak that served as the axis connecting different levels of existence and providing the foundation for all spiritual activity. This mountain, identified with Mount Kailash in western Tibet, was understood to be the dwelling place of the supreme Bon deity and the source of spiritual power that flowed throughout the Tibetan landscape. The cosmic mountain was surrounded by 4 rivers that flowed in the cardinal directions, creating a mandala-like pattern that served as a template for understanding the spiritual geography of the Tibetan plateau. The integration of shamanic elements within Bon tradition created a sophisticated system of spiritual practice that incorporated techniques for soul travel, communication with spiritual beings, and manipulation of natural forces through ritual intervention. Bonpo practitioners maintained the classical shamanic emphasis on direct spiritual experience while developing elaborate theoretical frameworks that explained the mechanics of spiritual phenomena and provided systematic approaches to advance practice. This combination of experiential shamanism with philosophical sophistication created a unique tradition that influenced subsequent developments in Tibetan Buddhism while maintaining its distinct characteristics. Bon ritual practices included the use of elaborate ceremonies designed to propitiate the numerous deities and spirits that populated the Tibetan spiritual landscape. These rituals often involve the construction of temporary sacred spaces using coloured sands, ritual objects, and symbolic representations that created microcosmic replicas of the cosmic order. The performance of these ceremonies required extensive training in the proper procedures for invoking different categories of spiritual beings and the specific offerings and protocols appropriate for each type of entity. The Bon tradition of sky burial represented one of the most distinctive shamanic practices found in the Tibetan cultural area. This mortuary custom involved the dismemberment of corpses and their exposure to vultures and other carrion-eating birds, based on the understanding that this method of body disposal facilitated the liberation of the deceased's consciousness and provided merit through the feeding of wild animals. The practice required the participation of specialized practitioners who possessed the spiritual authority to conduct the dismemberment rituals and the knowledge necessary to guide the consciousness of the deceased through the death process. Windhorse practices within Bon tradition represented a unique development of classical shamanic concepts related to spiritual power and its cultivation. The windhorse, or lungta, was understood as a form of spiritual energy that could be accumulated through proper ritual practice and deployed for various purposes including healing, protection, and the enhancement of personal power. Bonpo practitioners developed elaborate techniques for raising windhorse energy through the use of prayer flags, ritual circumambulation of sacred sites, and the performance of specific meditation practices designed to concentrate and direct this spiritual force. The relationship between Bon shamanism and the extreme environment of the Tibetan plateau created unique adaptations that distinguish these practices from shamanic traditions found in other regions. The high altitude and intense solar radiation characteristic of the Himalayan region required modifications in ritual practice to accommodate the physical challenges of performing ceremonies in such demanding conditions. The extreme cold of Tibetan winters necessitated the development of indoor ritual practices that could be conducted in the confined spaces of traditional Tibetan dwellings, while the brief summer season concentrated major outdoor ceremonies into a limited time period when weather conditions permitted elaborate ritual activities. Kazakh shamanism developed distinctive characteristics that reflected the specific environmental and cultural conditions of the Central Asian steppes occupied by these Turkic-speaking nomadic peoples. Kazakh shamans, known as Baksi, served crucial functions in maintaining tribal unity and providing spiritual guidance for communities that were constantly moving across vast grassland territories in search of pasture for their livestock. The Kazakh shamanic tradition incorporated elements derived from ancient Turkic spiritual practices while adapting to the specific requirements of their nomadic lifestyle and the challenging environment of the Eurasian steppes. The role of Kazakh shamans in maintaining tribal unity extended far beyond purely spiritual functions to encompass mediation of disputes, guidance in political decisions, and preservation of cultural traditions through oral transmission of historical narratives and genealogical information. Baksi served as living repositories of tribal memory, maintaining detailed knowledge of lineage relationships, traditional laws, and historical events that defined group identity and provided guidance for contemporary decision-making. This function proved particularly important for nomadic societies that lacked written records and depended on oral tradition for the preservation and transmission of cultural knowledge. Kazakh shamanic healing practices incorporated sophisticated understanding of the medicinal properties of plants found in steppe environments, combined with spiritual techniques for addressing the supernatural causes of illness and misfortune. Baksi practitioners developed extensive knowledge of the seasonal availability and proper harvesting techniques for medicinal plants that grew in different ecological zones encountered during nomadic migrations. This botanical knowledge was integrated with spiritual practices that involved communication with plant spirits, proper timing of gathering activities according to lunar and seasonal cycles, and the performance of rituals that enhanced the therapeutic effectiveness of natural remedies. The use of musical instruments in Kazakh shamanic practice created distinctive traditions that incorporated the stringed instruments characteristic of Turkic musical culture alongside the drums and other percussion instruments common to shamanic traditions throughout Central Asia. The dombra, a two-stringed plucked instrument, served important functions in Kazakh shamanic ceremonies as a means of inducing trance states, communicating with spiritual beings, and providing musical accompaniment for ritual activities. The integration of melodic instruments with percussive techniques created complex musical environments that enhanced the effectiveness of shamanic practice while reflecting the sophisticated musical traditions of Kazakh culture. Kyrgyz shamanic traditions developed in the mountainous regions of the Tian Shan and Pamir ranges, where the combination of high-altitude environments and nomadic pastoralism created unique challenges that shaped spiritual practice in distinctive ways. Kyrgyz shamans, known as bakshi, specialized in techniques adapted to mountain environments, including weatherworking appropriate for high-altitude conditions, communication with mountain spirits, and navigation of the complex spiritual geography created by the dramatic topographical variations characteristic of their homeland. The relationship between Kyrgyz shamanism and epic oral tradition created a unique synthesis of spiritual practice and literary expression that preserved both shamanic techniques and historical memory through the performance of elaborate narrative poems. The Epic of Manas, the great Kyrgyz oral tradition that recounts the legendary history of the Kyrgyz people, incorporated shamanic elements, including descriptions of spiritual journeys, communication with supernatural beings, and the use of magical techniques by heroic characters. The performers of this epic tradition, known as manaski, often possessed shamanic abilities that enhanced their capacity to deliver these lengthy performances and connect with audiences through spiritual as well as artistic means. Mountain shamanism in the Altai region represented one of the most conservative and well-preserved shamanic traditions in Central Asia, maintaining practices that preserved ancient elements of Turkic and Mongolic spiritual culture with minimal outside influence. The Altai Mountains, with their dramatic peaks, deep valleys, and diverse ecosystems, provided a geographical setting that fostered the development of shamanic practices specifically adapted to high mountain environments and the complex spiritual relationships between human communities and sacred landscapes. Altai shamans developed sophisticated techniques for working with mountain spirits, recognizing that different peaks, valleys, and geographical features possessed distinct spiritual characteristics that required specialized approaches. The practice of mountain pilgrimage involved shamanic journeys to sacred sites located at various elevations, each associated with specific types of spiritual power and particular categories of spiritual beings. These pilgrimage practices required extensive knowledge of mountain geography, weather patterns, and the seasonal accessibility of different sacred locations. Sacred landscape concepts in Altai shamanism created elaborate systems of geographical classification that recognized certain mountains, lakes, and other natural features as possessing special spiritual significance. These sacred sites served as focal points for shamanic practice and pilgrimage activities, while also functioning as territorial markers that defined the boundaries between different tribal groups and their associated spiritual jurisdictions. The maintenance of proper relationships with the spirits of sacred landscapes required ongoing ritual attention and the observance of specific taboos and protocols designed to prevent spiritual contamination or offense. Ancestor veneration practices among Altai peoples incorporated shamanic techniques for communication with deceased relatives and the maintenance of ongoing relationships between the living and the dead. Altai shamans served as intermediaries who could facilitate communication between community members and their deceased ancestors, providing guidance from the spirit world and ensuring that proper respect was maintained for ancestral spirits. These practices involved the use of specialized ritual sites, where ancestral spirits were believed to gather, the performance of offering ceremonies that provided sustenance for deceased relatives, and the conduct of divination sessions that enabled ancestors to provide advice and warnings to their living descendants. Celestial worship traditions in the Altai region incorporated sophisticated astronomical knowledge that enabled shamanic practitioners to coordinate their activities with celestial cycles and harness the spiritual energies associated with different astronomical phenomena. Altai shamans maintained detailed knowledge of star patterns, planetary movements, and seasonal variations in celestial phenomena that influenced the timing and effectiveness of different types of ritual practice. The observation of celestial events provided guidance for agricultural activities, the scheduling of major ceremonies, and the prediction of weather patterns and other natural phenomena that affected community life. The integration of shamanic practice with astronomical observation required the development of specialized knowledge and techniques that distinguish celestial shamanism from other forms of spiritual practice. Altai shamans learned to interpret the spiritual significance of various celestial phenomena, including meteor showers, eclipses, and the appearance of comets or other unusual astronomical events. These interpretive skills enabled shamanic practitioners to provide guidance regarding the spiritual implications of celestial occurrences, and to conduct appropriate rituals that either took advantage of favourable celestial conditions or provided protection against potentially harmful cosmic influences. The mountainous terrain of the Altai region had preserved shamanic traditions in their most archaic forms, but as we move eastward across the vast expanse of Asia, we encounter civilizations where shamanic practices underwent profound transformations through contact with emerging philosophical systems and organized religions. In China, Korea, and Japan, ancient shamanic traditions did not simply disappear with the rise of Confucianism, Buddhism, and other institutional belief systems. Instead, these primal spiritual technologies adapted, evolved, and found new expressions within the complex religious landscapes of East Asian civilizations. The Weiyu tradition of ancient China represents one of the earliest documented forms of shamanic practice in East Asia, with archaeological evidence dating back to the Shang dynasty. Oracle bone inscriptions from this period describe Wu practitioners as intermediaries between the human world and the realm of ancestral spirits, capable of inducing rain, healing illness, and communicating with deceased rulers. These early Chinese shamans operated within a cosmological framework that recognized the existence of multiple spiritual realms connected by a cosmic axis, much like their Siberian counterparts, but adapted to the agricultural civilization and hierarchical social structures that characterized early Chinese society. Wu shamanism developed sophisticated techniques for spirit mediumship that allowed practitioners to serve as vessels for various categories of spiritual beings. Unlike the soul journey methods preferred by nomadic shamans, Wu practitioners specialized in inviting spirits to possess their bodies during ritual ceremonies. This possession-based approach reflected the sedentary nature of Chinese civilization, where shamanic work was conducted in fixed locations rather than during migrations across vast landscapes. The Wu would enter trance states through drumming, dancing, and the consumption of alcoholic beverages, allowing their consciousness to withdraw while spiritual entities took control of their physical forms to communicate with human participants. The diagnostic and healing practices of Wu shamans incorporated early forms of what would later develop into traditional Chinese medicine. Wu practitioners understood illness as resulting from spiritual imbalances, ancestral displeasure, or demonic intrusion, requiring therapeutic interventions that address both physical symptoms and their underlying spiritual causes. They employed herbal remedies gathered according to specific ritual protocols, conducted exorcism ceremonies to remove malevolent spiritual influences, and performed soul-calling rituals to retrieve spiritual components that had become separated from patients' bodies. These healing methods combined empirical knowledge of medicinal plants with sophisticated understanding of the spiritual factors that influenced human health and well-being. The integration of Wu shamanism with ancestor worship created distinctive characteristics that differentiated Chinese shamanic practice from traditions found in other regions. Chinese Wu served as specialized intermediaries who could facilitate communication between living family members and their deceased relatives, ensuring that proper respect was maintained for ancestral spirits and that guidance from the spirit world remained available to subsequent generations. This function proved particularly important in Chinese society, where family lineage and ancestral authority played central roles in social organization and decision-making processes. Wu practitioners developed elaborate ritual protocols for conducting ancestral communication ceremonies that reflected the hierarchical nature of Chinese social structure. Different categories of ancestors required specific approaches based on their status during life, the length of time since their death, and their position within family genealogies. Imperial ancestors demanded the most elaborate ceremonial attention, involving complex offerings and formal protocols that acknowledged their elevated spiritual status. Common family ancestors received simpler but still carefully structured ritual recognition that maintained ongoing relationships between the living and the dead. The transformation of Wu shamanism during the Zhou dynasty reflects the broader changes occurring in Chinese civilization as political centralization and philosophical development created new frameworks for understanding spiritual phenomena. Zhou rulers appropriated shamanic techniques for state purposes, employing Wu practitioners to conduct weather magic that supported agricultural production and to perform divination that guided military and political decisions. This institutionalization of shamanic practice within state structures began a process of transformation that would continue throughout Chinese history, as shamanic elements were incorporated into emerging philosophical and religious systems. The influence of Wu shamanism on early Taoist development represents one of the most significant examples of shamanic adaptation within an organized philosophical tradition. Taoist practitioners adopted shamanic techniques for achieving altered states of consciousness, communicating with spiritual beings, and manipulating natural forces through ritual intervention. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, or effortless action, incorporated shamanic understanding of working in harmony with natural and spiritual forces rather than attempting to dominate them through purely human effort. Taoist meditation practices included techniques derived from shamanic soul journey methods, adapted for use within the philosophical framework of Taoist cosmology. The development of Taoist alchemy incorporated shamanic knowledge of plant medicines and consciousness-altering substances within systematic approaches to spiritual transformation. Early Taoist alchemists employed herbs, minerals and other natural materials that had been used by Wu shamans for centuries, but organized their use according to theoretical frameworks that explained the mechanisms through which these substances affected human consciousness and spiritual development. This integration created sophisticated practices that combined empirical knowledge with philosophical understanding, producing techniques that could be systematically taught and refined across generations of practitioners. Taoist exorcism practices retained many elements derived from Wu shamanic traditions, while adapting them to fit within Taoist cosmological frameworks. Taoist practitioners employed talismans, ritual implements, and ceremonial procedures that closely resembled those used by Wu shamans, but organized their application according to Taoist principles regarding the nature of spiritual entities and the proper methods for dealing with malevolent influences. The Taoist understanding of demons and evil spirits incorporated shamanic knowledge while providing systematic explanations for the origins and characteristics of these entities. The role of female practitioners within Chinese shamanic traditions created distinctive characteristics that persisted even as these practices evolved within changing religious and social contexts. Wu shamanism included numerous female practitioners who specialized in particular types of spiritual work, including healing, divination, and communication with female ancestral spirits. These women developed techniques and knowledge bases that were transmitted through female lineages, creating parallel traditions that complemented the male-dominated aspects of Chinese religious life. Female Wu practitioners often specialized in healing work that addressed specifically feminine concerns, including childbirth complications, reproductive health issues, and the spiritual problems associated with women's roles within patriarchal family structures. They developed extensive knowledge of herbs and therapeutic techniques that supported women's health, while also providing spiritual counseling and ritual support for women facing various life transitions. These specialized practices created networks of female spiritual practitioners who maintained shamanic knowledge and techniques, even as formal religious institutions became increasingly dominated by male hierarchies. The Korean Mudang tradition represents one of the most vibrant and persistent forms of shamanic practice in East Asia, maintaining its essential characteristics despite centuries of political suppression and social marginalization. Korean shamans, predominantly female practitioners known as Mudang, continue to serve crucial functions in Korean society as healers, ritual specialists, and intermediaries between the human and spiritual worlds. The Mudang tradition incorporates elements derived from ancient Korean shamanism, while adapting to the complex religious landscape created by the introduction of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Christianity to the Korean peninsula. Korean shamanic cosmology recognizes a complex hierarchy of spiritual beings that includes ancestral spirits, nature deities, and various categories of ghosts and demons that influence human affairs. The Mudang serves as the primary specialist capable of communicating with these entities and conducting the rituals necessary to maintain proper relationships between the human community and the spirit world. This cosmological framework reflects the mountainous geography of Korea, where numerous peaks, valleys, and geographical features are understood to possess their own spiritual guardians that require appropriate recognition and propitiation. The gut ceremony represents the central ritual practice of Korean shamanism, involving elaborate performances that combine music, dance, dramatic presentation, and spirit possession to address various spiritual needs within the community. These ceremonies can extend for many hours or even multiple days, involving the participation of numerous spiritual entities who are invoked to provide healing, guidance, or resolution of specific problems. The Mudang serves as the primary performer and ritual director, but gut ceremonies often involve multiple participants, including musicians, assistants, and family members of the individuals for whom the ritual is being conducted. Gut ceremonies addressing ancestral spirits form a crucial component of Korean shamanic practice, reflecting the continued importance of ancestor worship within Korean culture despite the influence of other religious traditions. These rituals provide opportunities for living family members to communicate with deceased relatives, resolve conflicts that may have originated before death, and ensure that proper respect is maintained for ancestral spirits. The Mudang serves as a medium through whom ancestral spirits can express their concerns, provide guidance, and receive the offerings and recognition they require for their continued well-being in the spirit world. The dramatic elements of gut ceremonies create powerful theatrical experiences that serve both spiritual and social functions within Korean communities. Mudang practitioners employ elaborate costumes, masks, and ritual implements to represent different spiritual entities during possession sequences. The visual spectacle of these performances, combined with the emotional intensity of spirit possession and the participation of community members, creates shared experiences that reinforce social bonds while addressing spiritual concerns. The theatrical aspects of gut ceremonies also serve educational functions, transmitting cultural knowledge and moral teachings through dramatic presentations that illustrate the consequences of various behaviors and the proper methods for maintaining spiritual harmony. Korean shamanic healing practices incorporate sophisticated diagnostic techniques that combine observation of physical symptoms with spiritual insight into the underlying causes of illness and misfortune. Mudang practitioners understand that many health problems result from spiritual imbalances caused by ancestral displeasure, violation of taboos, or attacks by malevolent spirits. The diagnostic process involves divination techniques that identify the specific spiritual factors contributing to the patient's condition, followed by the design of appropriate therapeutic interventions that address both physical and spiritual aspects of the problem. The therapeutic methods employed by Korean shamans include herbal remedies, ritual purification ceremonies, exorcism procedures, and soul retrieval techniques that restore spiritual components that may have become separated from the patient's body. Mudang practitioners maintain extensive knowledge of medicinal plants and their proper preparation, but understand that the effectiveness of herbal treatments depends on addressing the spiritual factors that created conditions conducive to illness. This holistic approach to healing recognizes that physical symptoms often represent manifestations of deeper spiritual problems that require specialized shamanic intervention to resolve completely. Ritual purification practices within Korean shamanism address spiritual contamination that can result from contact with death, violation of sacred spaces, or exposure to malevolent spiritual influences. These purification ceremonies involve the use of salt, water, fire, and other cleansing elements to remove spiritual impurities and restore proper spiritual balance. The Mudang conducts these rituals according to specific protocols that vary depending on the type and severity of contamination involved, employing techniques that range from simple blessing procedures to elaborate ceremonies involving multiple spiritual entities. The role of Korean shamanism in addressing social conflicts and community problems extends beyond individual healing to encompass broader concerns affecting entire families or neighborhoods. Mudang practitioners serve as mediators who can identify the spiritual factors contributing to ongoing disputes, business failures, or other forms of persistent misfortune. These interventions often reveal that apparently mundane problems have spiritual dimensions requiring shamanic attention, such as ancestral displeasure with family decisions or the presence of malevolent spirits in particular locations. Community gut ceremonies addressing collective concerns involve the participation of multiple families or entire neighborhoods in ritual activities designed to restore spiritual harmony and prevent future problems. These large-scale ceremonies require extensive preparation and coordination, involving the collection of appropriate offerings, the arrangement of ritual spaces, and the scheduling of activities to accommodate the participation of numerous spiritual entities. The success of community gut ceremonies depends on the cooperation of all participants and their willingness to address the spiritual factors that have contributed to collective problems. Japanese Miko priestesses represent a unique synthesis of shamanic practice with the organized religious traditions of Shinto, creating a form of institutionalized shamanism that has maintained its essential characteristics while adapting to the requirements of formal religious structures. The Miko tradition incorporates ancient Japanese shamanic practices within the framework of Shinto shrine organization, allowing female practitioners to serve as intermediaries between human communities and the kami, or spiritual beings that populate the Japanese spiritual landscape. The historical development of the Miko tradition reflects the gradual transformation of Japanese shamanism as it encountered Chinese religious and philosophical influences during the classical period of Japanese history. Early Japanese shamans, known as Miko or Fujo, serve functions similar to their counterparts in other regions, including healing, divination, and communication with spiritual beings. The introduction of Chinese writing systems, Buddhist philosophy, and Confucian political theories created new contexts for shamanic practice that required adaptation of traditional techniques to fit within emerging institutional frameworks. Miko priestesses developed specialized techniques for divine possession that allowed kami to communicate directly with human participants during Shinto rituals. These possession practices retained many characteristics of classical shamanism while adapting to the requirements of shrine-based religious practice. The Miko would enter trance states through ritual purification, sacred dance, and the recitation of specific prayers or invocations that invited particular kami to manifest through their bodies. The possessed Miko could then provide oracular guidance, healing interventions, or ritual blessings that channeled the power of the possessing deity. The integration of shamanic dance within Shinto ritual practice created distinctive performance traditions that combined spiritual technique with artistic expression. Miko priestesses developed elaborate dance forms that served both as methods for inducing trance states and as offerings to the kami. These sacred dances incorporated specific movements, costumes, and musical accompaniments that were understood to please particular deities while facilitating the altered states of consciousness necessary for divine possession. The aesthetic refinement of these dance traditions reflected broader Japanese cultural values while maintaining their essential shamanic functions. Oracular practices conducted by Miko priestesses provided guidance for individuals and communities facing important decisions or seeking insight into future events. These divination sessions involved the Miko entering possession states during which kami could provide direct communication regarding specific questions or concerns. The oracular pronouncements delivered through possessed Miko were understood to carry the authority of the possessing deity, making these practices important sources of guidance for both personal and political decision-making. The accuracy and usefulness of Miko oracles enhanced their reputation and ensured continued support for their activities within Shinto institutional structures. The role of Miko priestesses in conducting purification rituals reflects the central importance of spiritual cleanliness within Shinto practice and Japanese culture more broadly. Miko practitioners specialized in identifying and removing various forms of spiritual contamination that could affect individuals, families, or entire communities. These purification ceremonies employed water, salt, paper streamers, and other ritual implements to cleanse spiritual impurities and restore proper relationships between human participants and the kami. The effectiveness of these purification practices depended on the Miko's ability to perceive spiritual conditions and conduct appropriate cleansing procedures. Healing practices conducted by Miko priestesses incorporated shamanic techniques within the framework of Shinto understanding regarding the relationship between spiritual harmony and physical health. Miko practitioners understood that illness often resulted from spiritual imbalances caused by neglect of proper ritual observances, violation of taboos, or attacks by malevolent spirits. Their therapeutic interventions involved identifying the spiritual factors contributing to health problems and conducting appropriate rituals to restore spiritual balance and facilitate physical recovery. The seasonal festivals conducted at Shinto shrines provided regular opportunities for Miko priestesses to exercise their shamanic functions within community contexts. These festivals involved elaborate ceremonies that honored specific kami associated with agricultural cycles, seasonal transitions, or local geographical features. The Miko served crucial roles in these festivals as ritual specialists who could facilitate communication between human participants and the honored deities, ensuring that proper recognition was provided and that the kami's blessings were secured for the coming season. The syncretistic development of East Asian religious traditions created complex environments where shamanic elements were incorporated into multiple philosophical and religious systems simultaneously. In China, shamanic techniques appeared within Taoist practice, folk religious traditions, and even certain forms of Buddhism that adapted to Chinese cultural preferences. Korean shamanism coexisted with Buddhism and Confucianism, while maintaining its distinct characteristics and social functions. Japanese Shinto provided institutional frameworks that preserved shamanic practices while integrating them with imported religious and philosophical systems. This religious syncretism created opportunities for shamanic traditions to survive and adapt rather than disappearing entirely, as organized religions gained political and social dominance. shamanic practitioners found ways to reframe their activities within acceptable religious categories, allowing them to continue serving essential social functions while avoiding direct conflict with institutional authorities. The flexibility and adaptability of shamanic practice enabled it to find expression within diverse religious contexts, ensuring its continued relevance even as the broader religious landscape underwent fundamental transformations. The persistence of shamanic elements within East Asian religious traditions reflects the continued human need for direct spiritual experience, personal healing, and community ritual that addresses concerns not adequately met by purely philosophical or institutional approaches to religious life. The shamanic emphasis on individual spiritual experience, practical problem-solving, and community participation provided essential services that complemented rather than competed with the offerings of organized religious institutions. This complementary relationship enabled shamanic traditions to maintain their vitality while contributing to the rich diversity of East Asian spiritual culture. The vast continental expanse of the Americas provided geographical and cultural contexts that fostered shamanic traditions of extraordinary diversity and sophistication, developing in isolation from Old World influences for thousands of years before European contact. From the Arctic tundra of Alaska to the tropical rainforests of the Amazon basin, indigenous peoples created spiritual technologies that were perfectly adapted to their specific environments while sharing fundamental characteristics that mark them as distinctly shamanic in nature. These traditions represented some of the most complex and effective forms of shamanic practice ever developed, incorporating advanced knowledge of plant medicines, sophisticated astronomical observations, and intricate ceremonial systems that maintained the spiritual health of entire civilizations. The medicine people of North America's Great Plains developed shamanic practices that were intimately connected to the buffalo herds that provided the foundation of Plains Indian civilization. These practitioners, known by various terms including Wiccasawakan among the Lakota and Pujar among the Comanche, served as spiritual intermediaries who maintained the crucial relationships between human communities and the vast herds of bison that migrated across the grasslands in seasonal patterns. The success of buffalo hunting required more than simply locating and killing these animals. It demanded ongoing spiritual negotiations that ensured the cooperation of buffalo spirits and maintained the cosmic balance that allowed both human and animal populations to thrive on the Great Plains. Plains medicine people developed sophisticated techniques for buffalo calling that combined practical knowledge of animal behavior with spiritual practices designed to attract herds to specific locations where hunting could be conducted successfully. These ceremonies involved the use of sacred pipes, specific songs and dances, and the burning of particular plants that were believed to carry prayers to the buffalo spirits. The most skilled practitioners allegedly possessed the ability to communicate directly with buffalo spirits, learning the locations of herds and negotiating for their willingness to provide sustenance for human communities. The spiritual protocols governing buffalo hunting required careful attention to proper ceremonies both before and after kills, ensuring that the spirits of slain animals were honoured and that their cooperation would continue in future hunts. The Vision Quest tradition among Plains peoples represented one of the most distinctive and widespread shamanic practices in North America, providing a standardized method for individuals to seek direct spiritual guidance and acquire personal power through prolonged isolation and fasting. These quests typically involved young men, and occasionally women, spending 4 days and nights alone in remote locations without food or water, seeking visions that would provide spiritual guidance for their adult lives. The physical ordeal of fasting and exposure to the elements created altered states of consciousness that facilitated contact with spiritual beings who might choose to become lifelong allies and sources of power. Vision Quest sites were carefully selected based on their spiritual significance and isolation from human habitation. Mountain peaks, isolated buttes, and remote valleys provided the solitude necessary for successful quests, while offering geographical features that were believed to facilitate communication with spiritual beings. The preparation for vision quests involved purification ceremonies conducted by experienced medicine people who provided guidance regarding proper protocols and spiritual preparation. Participants underwent sweat lodge ceremonies, received instruction in appropriate prayers and songs, and learned the specific procedures for conducting themselves during their solitary vigils. The spiritual beings encountered during vision quests provided participants with personal medicine that would guide and protect them throughout their lives. These spirit allies typically appeared in animal forms, though they might also manifest as natural phenomena such as thunder, wind, or lightning. Each spirit ally brought specific types of power and knowledge that would influence the recipient's role within their community and their approach to various life challenges. The most powerful visions might include prophecies regarding future events, instructions for conducting specific ceremonies, or the revelation of new songs and dances that would benefit the entire community. Sweat lodge ceremonies served multiple functions within plain shamanic practice, providing regular opportunities for spiritual purification, community bonding, and communication with spiritual beings. These dome-shaped structures, constructed from willow branches and covered with buffalo hides or other materials, created sacred spaces where participants could undergo intense physical and spiritual experiences that cleansed both body and spirit. The ceremonies involved pouring water over heated stones to create steam that induced profuse sweating while participants engaged in prayers, songs, and spiritual conversations that address both individual and community concerns. The construction of sweat lodges required careful attention to spiritual as well as practical considerations. The framework was typically oriented according to cardinal directions, with the entrance facing east to welcome the rising sun and the new spiritual energy it represented. The fire pit where stones were heated was located east of the lodge, creating a sacred pathway between the fire and the lodge entrance that represented the connection between physical and spiritual realms. The selection and preparation of stones required spiritual guidance, as different types of stone possessed varying spiritual characteristics that influenced the quality of the ceremonial experience. Medicine bundles among plainspeoples contained collections of sacred objects that served as repositories of spiritual power and focal points for various types of shamanic work. These bundles, carefully wrapped in specially prepared animal hides, contained items that had acquired spiritual significance through their association with successful vision quests, powerful dreams, or significant events in the owner's spiritual development. The contents might include animal parts, unusual stones, plant materials, and manufactured objects that had been blessed or empowered through specific ceremonies. Each bundle was unique to its owner and reflected their particular spiritual relationships and sources of power. The care and maintenance of medicine bundles required ongoing ritual attention and adherence to specific protocols that ensured their continued effectiveness. Bundle owners conducted regular ceremonies that fed the spiritual inhabitants of their bundles with offerings of tobacco, sweetgrass, and other materials believed to nourish spiritual beings. The bundles were opened only under appropriate ceremonial conditions and with proper spiritual preparation, as improper handling could result in the loss of their power or even spiritual retaliation against the offending individual. The transfer of medicine bundles to new owners involved elaborate ceremonies that ensured the spiritual inhabitants accepted their new caretakers and continued to provide their protection and assistance. Sacred pipe ceremonies represented perhaps the most widespread and significant ritual practice among North American indigenous peoples, transcending tribal boundaries and serving as a common spiritual technology that facilitated communication between human communities and the spirit world. The pipe itself was understood as a sacred instrument that carried prayers to spiritual beings while creating a direct connection between the smoker and the cosmic forces that governed existence. The tobacco or other plant materials burned in the pipe served as offerings that pleased spiritual beings while creating the altered states of consciousness necessary for effective shamanic work. The construction of sacred pipes required specialized knowledge and spiritual guidance, as different materials and designs were appropriate for different types of ceremonial use. The most sacred pipes were carved from red pipestone quarried from specific locations that were considered sacred to multiple tribal groups. The stems were typically made from ash or other woods that possessed appropriate spiritual characteristics, often decorated with feathers, beads, and other ornaments that enhanced their spiritual potency. The creation of a new pipe involved ceremonies that consecrated the instrument and established its spiritual identity and purpose. Woodland peoples of eastern North America developed shamanic traditions that were adapted to forest environments and the seasonal cycles of deciduous woodlands. These practitioners, working within cultures that combined hunting, gathering, and agriculture, created spiritual technologies that maintained relationships with the diverse spiritual beings that inhabited forest ecosystems. Woodland shamans specialized in plant medicine, weatherworking, and the complex spiritual protocols required for successful agriculture in environments where crop success depended on careful attention to seasonal timing and spiritual factors. The green corn ceremony among southeastern peoples represented one of the most elaborate agricultural rituals in North America, involving community-wide celebrations that mark the ripening of corn crops and renewed spiritual relationships for the coming year. These ceremonies required the participation of specialized practitioners who could conduct the complex rituals necessary for agricultural success and community spiritual health. The celebrations involved fasting, purification ceremonies, the lighting of new fires, and the consumption of the first corn of the season, according to specific spiritual protocols that ensured continued agricultural productivity. Woodland medicine people developed extensive knowledge of forest plants and their medicinal and spiritual properties, creating pharmacological traditions that rivaled those found anywhere in the world. These practitioners understood that effective plant medicine required more than simply knowing which plants treated specific ailments. It demanded ongoing relationships with plant spirits and adherence to proper protocols for gathering, preparing, and administering herbal remedies. The most skilled plant medicine practitioners allegedly could communicate directly with plant spirits, learning their preferred growing conditions, optimal harvesting times, and most effective preparation methods. The gathering of medicinal plants involved elaborate ceremonies that honoured plant spirits and ensured their cooperation in providing healing assistance. Medicine people offered tobacco, prayers, and other gifts to plant spirits before harvesting, explaining the purpose for which the plants were needed and requesting their permission to gather them. The timing of plant gathering was coordinated with lunar cycles, seasonal changes, and specific spiritual conditions that influenced the potency of different plant medicines. The preparation of herbal remedies involved additional ceremonies that enhanced their therapeutic effectiveness, while ensuring that plant spirits remained willing to provide their healing assistance. Southwestern peoples developed shamanic traditions that were adapted to arid environments and the unique challenges of desert survival. These practitioners, working within cultures that had achieved remarkable success in desert agriculture and water management, created spiritual technologies that maintained relationships with rain spirits, managed the complex spiritual ecology of desert environments, and provided healing services using the distinctive plant and mineral resources available in arid regions. Southwestern shamanism incorporated sophisticated astronomical knowledge that enabled practitioners to coordinate their activities with celestial cycles and predict seasonal weather patterns crucial for desert survival. Pueblo rain ceremonies represented some of the most elaborate and effective weatherworking practices found anywhere in the world, involving community-wide rituals that could extend for days or weeks, and required the participation of multiple ceremonial societies with specialized knowledge and responsibilities. These ceremonies combined dance, music, visual arts, and spiritual technologies that were designed to attract rain clouds and ensure adequate precipitation for agricultural success in environments where water scarcity posed constant challenges. The effectiveness of these rain ceremonies was demonstrated by the sustained agricultural productivity that enabled Pueblo communities to thrive in desert environments for over 1,000 years. Hopi snake ceremonies involved the ritual handling of live rattlesnakes and other venomous serpents as part of elaborate rain-making rituals that demonstrated the spiritual power of ceremonial participants, while petitioning snake spirits to intercede with rain deities on behalf of the community. These dangerous ceremonies required extensive spiritual preparation and protection, as participants had to overcome their natural fear of venomous snakes while maintaining the spiritual focus necessary for effective ritual performance. The snake priests who conducted these ceremonies possessed specialized knowledge of snake behavior and spiritual techniques for avoiding snakebite while handling these dangerous creatures during public performances. Navajo Hatali, or medicine people, developed one of the most sophisticated and complex healing traditions in North America, creating an elaborate system of ceremonial practices that addressed virtually every type of illness and misfortune that might affect human beings. The Navajo ceremonial system included hundreds of different chants, each designed to address specific categories of spiritual imbalance and restore proper harmony between individuals and the cosmic forces that governed existence. These ceremonies could extend for days or weeks and required the participation of skilled practitioners who had memorized vast amounts of ritual knowledge, including songs, prayers, sand painting designs, and the proper procedures for conducting complex healing rituals. Sand painting creation represented one of the most distinctive and sophisticated ritual arts developed by southwestern peoples, involving the construction of elaborate designs using colored sands, pollens, and other natural materials that served as temporary altars and healing spaces during ceremonial performances. These intricate designs, some measuring 12 feet or more in diameter, depicted the spiritual beings and cosmic forces involved in specific healing ceremonies while creating sacred spaces where patients could receive spiritual treatment. The creation of sand paintings required extensive training and spiritual preparation, as errors in design or execution could render the ceremony ineffective or even dangerous to participants. Mesoamerican curanderismo represents a unique synthesis of indigenous shamanic traditions, with influences introduced through Spanish colonization, creating hybrid healing systems that combined pre-Columbian plant medicine knowledge with European herbal traditions and Catholic religious symbolism. These practitioners, known as curanderos or curanderas, maintained essential elements of indigenous shamanic practice, while adapting to the cultural and religious constraints imposed by colonial authorities. The resulting traditions preserved crucial indigenous knowledge while developing new forms of expression that enabled shamanic healing to continue under changed political and social conditions. The integration of Catholic saints and religious imagery within curanderismo practice created syncretic systems that allowed indigenous practitioners to continue their healing work while appearing to conform to Christian religious requirements. Many curanderos incorporated prayers to Catholic saints within their healing ceremonies, understanding these figures as new names for traditional spiritual beings who continued to provide healing assistance despite the changed religious environment. This religious syncretism enabled the preservation of indigenous healing knowledge while avoiding direct confrontation with colonial authorities, who might otherwise have suppressed these practices as pagan superstitions. Plant spirit medicine traditions among curanderos maintained sophisticated knowledge of medicinal plants and their spiritual properties, preserving indigenous pharmacological knowledge while adapting to new cultural contexts. These practitioners continue to work with traditional healing plants while also incorporating European herbs and healing techniques that proved effective for treating various ailments. The resulting medical systems combined the best elements of both indigenous and European healing traditions, while maintaining the spiritual understanding that effective healing required addressing both physical symptoms and their underlying spiritual causes. Sobadores, traditional Mexican healers who specialized in massage and manipulation techniques, represented another form of curanderismo that preserved indigenous bodywork knowledge within modified cultural frameworks. These practitioners understood that physical ailments often resulted from spiritual imbalances that could be addressed through specific manipulation techniques, combined with prayers, herbal remedies, and spiritual cleansing procedures. Sobadores maintained detailed knowledge of human anatomy and physiology, while also understanding the spiritual factors that influenced physical health and recovery from injury or illness. Amazonian ayahuasqueros developed perhaps the most sophisticated plant medicine traditions in the world, creating healing systems based on the use of ayahuasca and other psychoactive plants that enabled direct communication with plant spirits and provided access to spiritual realms where healing and divination could be accomplished. These practitioners, working within the incredibly biodiverse environment of the Amazon rainforest, developed relationships with hundreds of different plant species and created complex ceremonial systems that safely and effectively utilized some of the most powerful consciousness-altering substances known to humanity. The preparation and administration of ayahuasca required extensive training and spiritual preparation, as this powerful plant medicine could produce profound alterations in consciousness that were potentially dangerous if not properly managed. Ayahuasqueros underwent lengthy apprenticeships, during which they learned to work with plant spirits, developed resistance to the toxic effects of various plant medicines, and mastered the songs and ritual procedures necessary for conducting safe and effective healing ceremonies. The training process often involved years of dietary restrictions, sexual abstinence, and social isolation that enabled apprentices to develop the spiritual sensitivity and personal power necessary for advanced plant medicine work. Shipibo textile traditions in Peru incorporated visionary patterns received during ayahuasca ceremonies into elaborate geometric designs that served both artistic and spiritual functions. These intricate patterns, painted on cloth and pottery or tattooed on human skin, represented visual maps of spiritual realms and the relationships between different categories of spiritual beings. Shipibo women who created these textiles often worked under the guidance of plant spirits, receiving specific design instructions during visionary experiences that ensured their artistic creations possessed appropriate spiritual power and significance. The Icaros, or healing songs, used by Amazonian shamans represented sophisticated technologies for directing spiritual energy and communicating with plant spirits during ayahuasca ceremonies. These songs, received directly from plant teachers during visionary experiences, contained specific vibrational frequencies and melodic patterns that could influence the direction and intensity of ayahuasca experiences while providing protection and guidance for ceremony participants. Master ayahuasqueros possessed extensive repertoires of Icaros that enabled them to address various types of healing needs and spiritual challenges that might arise during plant medicine work. Tobacco shamanism throughout the Americas represented one of the most widespread and significant indigenous spiritual technologies, involving the use of various tobacco species for communication with spiritual beings, healing, and ceremonial purposes. Indigenous peoples developed sophisticated understanding of tobacco's psychoactive properties and spiritual significance, using this plant in ways that were fundamentally different from the recreational smoking practices that developed after European contact. Tobacco served as a sacred offering that pleased spiritual beings, while creating altered states of consciousness that facilitated shamanic work. The cultivation and preparation of ceremonial tobacco required spiritual guidance and adherence to specific protocols that ensured the plant retained its sacred characteristics and spiritual potency. Different varieties of tobacco were grown for different ceremonial purposes, with some strains being particularly powerful and requiring careful handling to avoid adverse effects. The curing and preparation of tobacco involved ceremonies that enhanced its spiritual properties while ensuring that tobacco spirits remained willing to provide their assistance during shamanic work. Coca shamanism in the Andean regions represented another sophisticated plant medicine tradition that enabled indigenous peoples to work effectively at high altitudes while maintaining spiritual relationships with mountain spirits and other entities that inhabited the dramatic landscape of the Andes. Coca leaves provided both physical sustenance that enabled work at extreme altitudes and spiritual communion with plant spirits that offered guidance and protection in the challenging mountain environment. The cultivation and use of coca involved elaborate spiritual protocols that maintained proper relationships between human communities and the spiritual forces that governed Andean ecosystems. The sacred groves of ancient Europe witnessed the gradual transformation of shamanic practices as they encountered the expanding influence of Christianity and the political consolidation that would reshape the continent's spiritual landscape. Yet beneath the surface of this religious revolution, the fundamental human need for direct spiritual intervention, healing, and magical assistance ensured that shamanic elements would persist, adapt, and find new expressions within the folk traditions of medieval and early modern Europe. The cunning folk, wise women, and traditional healers who emerged from this cultural synthesis preserved essential shamanic techniques while operating within the complex religious and social constraints of Christian civilization. Celtic Druidism represented one of the most sophisticated pre-Christian spiritual traditions in Europe, incorporating shamanic elements within an elaborate philosophical and ritual system that governed Celtic society across much of Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe. The Druids, functioning as priests, judges, teachers, and healers within Celtic communities, maintained practices that bore striking similarities to classical shamanism while adapting these techniques to the needs of increasingly complex agricultural societies. Archaeological evidence from sacred groves, ritual deposits, and burial sites reveals a spiritual tradition that combined shamanic soul journey techniques with sophisticated astronomical knowledge and elaborate ceremonial systems. The sacred groves that served as primary ritual centres for Celtic Druids created natural temples where the boundaries between physical and spiritual realms were understood to be particularly permeable. These woodland sanctuaries, often centred around ancient oak trees or natural springs, provided settings where Druids conducted their most important ceremonies, including initiation rites, seasonal celebrations, and the complex judicial procedures that maintained social order within Celtic communities. The selection and consecration of these sacred spaces required shamanic techniques for communicating with the spirits of place and establishing proper spiritual relationships with the natural forces that inhabited specific geographical locations. Druidic divination practices incorporated sophisticated methods for obtaining spiritual guidance that combined empirical observation with shamanic insight into the hidden patterns governing natural and human affairs. The Druids developed elaborate systems of augury based on the behaviour of birds, the patterns of cloud formations, and the appearance of various natural phenomena that were understood to carry messages from the spirit world. These divinatory techniques required extensive training in the interpretation of natural signs, while also demanding the shamanic ability to perceive the spiritual dimensions of apparently mundane events. The use of mistletoe in Druidic ritual reflected shamanic understanding of certain plants as possessing special spiritual properties that could facilitate communication between different realms of existence. The ceremonial harvesting of mistletoe from oak trees involved elaborate protocols that honoured the plant's spirits while ensuring that the gathered material retained its full spiritual potency. Classical accounts describe Druids using golden sickles to cut mistletoe during specific lunar phases, catching the falling branches in white cloth to prevent them from touching the ground and losing their sacred power. This careful attention to harvesting procedures reflected shamanic knowledge that the effectiveness of plant medicines depended not only on their inherent properties, but also on the spiritual conditions under which they were gathered. Druidic healing practices combined extensive knowledge of herbal medicine with shamanic techniques for addressing the spiritual causes of illness and misfortune. Celtic healers understood that physical ailments often resulted from spiritual imbalances caused by violations of sacred laws, attacks by malevolent spirits, or disruption of the proper relationships between individuals and their spiritual environment. Treatment involved both the administration of appropriate plant remedies and the performance of ritual procedures designed to restore spiritual harmony and remove the underlying causes of disease. The training required to become a druid involved decades of memorization and spiritual development that transformed candidates into living repositories of Celtic cultural knowledge and spiritual wisdom. Classical sources describe training periods extending up to 20 years during which students memorized vast amounts of poetry, mythology, legal precedents and ritual procedures that could not be committed to writing due to religious prohibitions against recording sacred knowledge. This oral tradition created dynamic systems of knowledge preservation that allowed for gradual adaptation and evolution while maintaining essential core elements across generations of practitioners. Druidic understanding of reincarnation and the afterlife incorporated shamanic concepts regarding the multiple components of human souls and their various destinies following physical death. Celtic beliefs recognized that different aspects of human consciousness might follow different paths after death, with some components remaining attached to specific geographical locations, while others journeyed to otherworldly realms or returned to inhabit new physical bodies. This complex understanding of post-mortem existence required shamanic specialists who could guide dying individuals through the death process and assist the living in maintaining proper relationships with deceased relatives. The seasonal festivals that structured Celtic religious life provided regular opportunities for druidic practitioners to exercise their shamanic functions within community contexts. The four major Celtic festivals, Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane and Lugnasad, marked crucial transitions in the agricultural and pastoral cycles, while also representing periods when the boundaries between physical and spiritual realms became particularly permeable. During these festivals, Druids conducted elaborate ceremonies that honoured the spiritual forces governing seasonal changes while providing protection and guidance for their communities during vulnerable transitional periods. Samhain, marking the beginning of the Celtic New Year and the onset of winter, represented the most spiritually significant festival in the Celtic calendar. During this 3-day celebration, the normal barriers between the world of the living and the realm of the dead were understood to dissolve, allowing deceased ancestors to visit their living relatives, while also creating opportunities for malevolent spirits to cause harm. Druidic practitioners served crucial roles during Samhain as spiritual guardians, who could facilitate beneficial contact with ancestral spirits, while providing protection against dangerous supernatural entities that might exploit the temporary permeability between realms. The transformation of Celtic Druidism under Roman occupation and subsequent Christianization created complex processes of adaptation and resistance that would influence European folk traditions for centuries to come. Roman authorities, recognizing the political influence wielded by Druids within Celtic society, systematically suppressed Druidic practices while attempting to co-opt certain elements within Roman religious frameworks. The later arrival of Christianity introduced additional pressures that forced Druidic knowledge underground, where it survived within folk traditions that preserved essential shamanic elements while avoiding direct confrontation with Christian authorities. Scandinavian cedar magic represented another sophisticated pre-Christian shamanic tradition that incorporated distinctive characteristics adapted to the cultural and environmental conditions of Northern Europe. Cedar practitioners, known as Sidramada or Sidracona, specialized in techniques for soul travel, prophetic divination, and spiritual manipulation that bore striking similarities to classical Siberian shamanism, while displaying unique features that reflected Scandinavian cultural values and cosmological understanding. The practice of Sida involved entering trance states during which practitioners could project their consciousness across vast distances, communicate with spiritual beings, and perceive hidden information regarding past, present, and future events. The technique of spiritual shapeshifting within Sida tradition enabled practitioners to assume animal forms during their otherworldly journeys, travelling in the guise of ravens, wolves, bears, or other creatures that possess specific spiritual characteristics suited for different types of magical work. These transformation abilities required extensive training and spiritual preparation, as the consciousness travelling in animal form remained vulnerable to various spiritual hazards, while the physical body left behind required protection from malevolent entities that might attempt to possess the temporarily vacant form. The most skilled Sida practitioners allegedly could maintain awareness in multiple forms simultaneously, observing events from different perspectives while gathering comprehensive information about complex spiritual situations. Prophetic practices within Sida tradition incorporated sophisticated methods for perceiving future events and providing guidance regarding optimal courses of action in various circumstances. Sida practitioners understood that the future existed as a complex web of possibilities that could be influenced by human actions, spiritual interventions, and the ongoing interplay between various cosmic forces. Their prophetic work involved navigating this web of potential outcomes to identify the most likely developments while also determining what actions might be taken to influence events in favourable directions. This understanding of prophecy as involving active participation rather than passive prediction reflected shamanic concepts regarding the dynamic relationship between human consciousness and the unfolding patterns of existence. The use of ritual platforms or high seats during Sida ceremonies created elevated spaces where practitioners could conduct their spiritual work while remaining accessible to community members seeking guidance or assistance. These specially constructed platforms, often located outdoors in settings that provided clear views of the surrounding landscape, served as launching points for soul travel, while also functioning as stages where the results of otherworldly journeys could be communicated to assembled audiences. The elevation provided by these platforms was understood to facilitate the practitioner's ability to perceive distant events, while also symbolically representing their temporary ascension to spiritual realms where prophetic information could be obtained. Sida practitioners developed elaborate techniques for working with the spirits of the dead, including methods for summoning deceased individuals to provide information about past events or guidance regarding contemporary problems. These necromantic practices required considerable skill and spiritual protection, as contact with the dead involved inherent risks, including the possibility of spiritual contamination or attacks by malevolent entities attracted to such activities. The most accomplished Sida practitioners allegedly could compel even unwilling spirits to provide information, though such coercive techniques were considered dangerous and ethically questionable within Scandinavian spiritual frameworks. The integration of Sida practice with Norse cosmology created sophisticated systems of spiritual navigation that enabled practitioners to travel safely through the complex geography of the 9 worlds described in Scandinavian mythology. These otherworldly journeys required detailed knowledge of the spiritual landmarks, pathways, and inhabitants of different cosmic realms, as well as the diplomatic skills necessary for negotiating with various categories of spiritual beings encountered during such travels. Sida practitioners served as psychopomps who could guide human souls through this complex spiritual geography, while also functioning as ambassadors who maintained relationships between human communities and the various supernatural entities that influence mortal affairs. The association of Sida practice with certain forms of spiritual manipulation and cursing created complex social attitudes that combined respect for practitioners' abilities with suspicion regarding their potential for causing harm. Cedar magic included techniques for influencing weather patterns, affecting the outcomes of battles, causing or curing illnesses, and manipulating human emotions and behaviors through spiritual intervention. These powerful capabilities made cedar practitioners valuable allies, but also potential threats, leading to social dynamics that emphasize the importance of maintaining proper relationships with these specialists while also developing protections against possible magical attacks. The survival of cedar elements within later Scandinavian folk traditions can be traced through various practices that preserved essential shamanic techniques while adapting to Christian religious frameworks. The Volva, or wandering wise women, who appeared in medieval Scandinavian sources, maintained many characteristics of earlier cedar practitioners while operating within social contexts that had been transformed by Christianization. These women continued to provide divination services, healing assistance, and magical protection while carefully avoiding practices that might be interpreted as explicitly pagan or demonic by Christian authorities. The cunning folk who emerged throughout medieval and early modern Europe represented a remarkable synthesis of pre-Christian shamanic traditions with Christian religious symbolism and classical magical knowledge derived from learned traditions. These practitioners, known by various terms including wise women, wizards, charmers and healers, served essential functions within their communities as providers of magical services that addressed practical problems not adequately handled by official religious or medical authorities. The cunning folk operated within a complex social environment that required them to demonstrate their Christian orthodoxy while maintaining access to spiritual techniques that derived from much older shamanic traditions. Cunning folk healing practices incorporated sophisticated diagnostic techniques that combined empirical observation with spiritual insight into the hidden causes of illness and misfortune. These practitioners understood that physical ailments often resulted from spiritual factors including witchcraft attacks, violations of sacred taboos, or disruption of proper relationships with spiritual entities. Their diagnostic methods involved careful questioning of patients regarding recent activities and encounters that might have triggered spiritual problems, combined with divination techniques that revealed the supernatural dimensions of various health conditions. This holistic approach to diagnosis enabled cunning folk to address both the immediate symptoms of illness and the underlying spiritual factors that had created conditions conducive to disease. The therapeutic methods employed by cunning folk combined traditional herbal knowledge with Christian prayers, ritual procedures, and magical techniques that addressed the spiritual aspects of healing. Plant remedies were prepared according to traditional methods that had been passed down through generations of folk healers, but their administration was accompanied by Christian prayers and blessings that provided additional spiritual power while demonstrating the practitioner's religious orthodoxy. This synthesis of pagan plant knowledge with Christian spiritual authority created effective healing systems that could operate within the religious constraints of medieval and early modern European society. Protective magic represented another crucial service provided by cunning folk, addressing widespread concerns regarding witchcraft attacks, demonic influence, and various forms of supernatural harm that might affect individuals, families, or entire communities. These practitioners created protective amulets and charms that combined traditional magical symbols with Christian religious imagery, producing objects that provided spiritual protection while appearing to conform to acceptable religious standards. The most effective protective devices allegedly could repel witchcraft attacks, prevent demonic possession, and shield their users from various forms of supernatural harm that might otherwise cause serious injury or death. Countermagic techniques developed by cunning folk enabled them to diagnose and treat victims of witchcraft while also providing methods for identifying the perpetrators of magical attacks. These practices required considerable skill and spiritual protection, as direct confrontation with hostile magical practitioners involved inherent risks, including the possibility of retaliatory attacks or escalation of magical conflicts. cunning folk developed elaborate procedures for safely conducting countermagic work, including methods for spiritual protection, techniques for gathering evidence of witchcraft activity, and rituals for neutralizing or reversing harmful spells without exposing themselves to dangerous magical retaliation. The role of cunning folk in treasure hunting and the location of lost objects reflected their mastery of divination techniques that enabled them to perceive hidden information regarding the location of valuable items. These services proved particularly valuable in societies where the burial of treasure during times of conflict created ongoing opportunities for the recovery of hidden wealth. Cunning folk employed various divination methods, including the use of divining rods, scrying with crystals or mirrors, and communication with spiritual entities who possessed knowledge of hidden treasures. The most skilled practitioners allegedly could locate buried gold, silver, and other valuables that had been concealed for decades or even centuries. Love magic and relationship counseling provided additional sources of income for cunning folk, while addressing fundamental human needs that were not adequately served by official religious authorities. These practitioners developed sophisticated techniques for influencing human emotions and behaviors through spiritual intervention, creating spells and charms that could attract desired partners, restore failing relationships, or protect existing marriages from interference by rivals. The ethical dimensions of love magic created complex moral considerations that required practitioners to balance their clients' desires with broader concerns regarding free will and the potential consequences of magical manipulation. Agricultural magic formed an essential component of cunning folk practice in rural communities where crop success determined the difference between prosperity and starvation. These practitioners provided services that protected crops from disease, pests, and adverse weather conditions, while also enhancing soil fertility and ensuring optimal growing conditions for various agricultural products. Weatherworking techniques enabled skilled cunning folk to influence local weather patterns, bringing rain during droughts or clearing skies during crucial harvest periods. The timing of agricultural activities according to lunar cycles and seasonal patterns required specialized knowledge that combined practical farming experience with spiritual understanding of the natural forces that influence plant growth and development. The persecution of European folk magical traditions during the witch trials of the early modern period created complex dynamics that affected cunning folk differently than other categories of magical practitioners. While many cunning folk successfully avoided persecution by emphasizing their Christian orthodoxy and their role in combating, rather than practicing harmful magic, others found themselves accused of witchcraft when their activities attracted the attention of religious or secular authorities. The survival strategies developed by cunning folk during this dangerous period included careful documentation of their Christian credentials, cultivation of relationships with influential community members who could provide protection, and modification of their practices to avoid activities that might be interpreted as explicitly demonic or heretical. The transformation of cunning folk traditions during the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment created new challenges as empirical approaches to medicine and natural philosophy began to challenge the theoretical foundations of magical practice. Some cunning folk adapted to these changing intellectual environments by reframing their activities in terms that were more compatible with emerging scientific understanding, while others retreated to remote rural areas where traditional beliefs remained strong and their services continued to be valued by local communities. The gradual decline of belief in magic and supernatural causation reduced demand for cunning folk services while also creating social pressures that discouraged individuals from openly practicing magical arts. The documentation of cunning folk practices in court records, church registers, and contemporary accounts provides valuable insights into the persistence of shamanic elements within European folk culture despite centuries of Christian dominance and increasing scientific skepticism. These historical sources reveal that essential shamanic techniques including soul travel, spirit communication, and magical healing continued to be practiced throughout Europe well into the modern period, adapted to local cultural conditions and religious constraints, but maintaining their fundamental characteristics as technologies for direct spiritual intervention in human affairs. The geographical distribution of cunning folk traditions across Europe reveals regional variations that reflected local cultural preferences, environmental conditions, and historical experiences, while maintaining core characteristics that mark these practices as fundamentally shamanic in nature. Scandinavian traditions preserved stronger connections to pre-Christian cedar practices, while Mediterranean regions showed greater influence from classical magical traditions and Islamic esoteric knowledge. Germanic areas developed distinctive synthesis of folk shamanism with Christian mystical traditions, while Celtic regions maintained stronger connections to Druidic knowledge and practices. These regional variations created rich diversity within European folk magical traditions, while preserving essential shamanic elements that had sustained European communities for millennia before the arrival of Christianity. The arrival of European colonial powers across the globe during the 15th through 19th centuries marked the beginning of the most systematic and devastating assault on shamanic traditions in human history. Unlike previous religious conversions that often allowed for syncretism and adaptation, colonial expansion brought with it an unprecedented combination of military force, administrative control, and missionary zeal that sought not merely to convert indigenous peoples, but to completely eradicate their traditional spiritual practices. The colonial enterprise viewed shamanic traditions as fundamental obstacles to both Christian conversion and the establishment of European-style governance, leading to coordinated campaigns of suppression that would fundamentally alter the spiritual landscape of entire continents. Spanish conquistadors in the Americas encountered sophisticated shamanic traditions that had developed over millennia, but their response was shaped by recent experiences with the Inquisition and a militant Christianity that viewed any non-Christian spiritual practice as demonic in origin. The systematic destruction of Aztec, Maya, and Inca religious centers represented more than simple conquest. It constituted a deliberate attempt to sever indigenous peoples from their spiritual foundations and render them psychologically dependent on European religious and political authority. Spanish colonial administrators recognized that shamanic practitioners served as focal points for indigenous resistance, maintaining not only spiritual traditions, but also cultural memory and social cohesion that could threaten colonial control. The encomienda system established by Spanish colonizers created economic structures that deliberately undermined traditional indigenous social organization, including the support systems that sustained shamanic practitioners. Under this arrangement, indigenous communities were assigned to Spanish colonists who extracted tribute and labor while ostensibly providing Christian instruction and protection. The economic demands of the encomienda system disrupted seasonal ceremonial cycles, scattered traditional communities, and created conditions of poverty and social disorganization that made it difficult for shamanic traditions to maintain their elaborate ritual requirements and training systems. Spanish missionaries, particularly the Franciscans and Jesuits, developed sophisticated strategies for identifying and neutralizing indigenous spiritual leaders. They recognized that successful conversion required more than simply teaching Christian doctrine. It demanded the active suppression of shamanic practices that provided alternative sources of spiritual authority and healing. Missionary accounts from Mexico describe elaborate campaigns to locate and destroy shamanic ritual equipment, including drums, masks, sacred bundles, and other objects that served as repositories of spiritual power. The public burning of these items served both practical and symbolic functions, depriving shamans of their tools while demonstrating Spanish spiritual superiority to indigenous audiences. The Spanish colonial legal system codified anti-shamanic policies through detailed regulations that criminalized specific indigenous spiritual practices while providing legal frameworks for their prosecution. The ordinances of 1573 explicitly prohibited indigenous ceremonies, the use of traditional medicines, and communication with spiritual beings, establishing penalties that range from public flogging to execution for persistent offenders. These laws created legal precedents that would be adapted and implemented throughout Spanish colonial territories, providing administrative tools for the systematic suppression of shamanic traditions across vast geographical areas. Indigenous responses to Spanish suppression efforts revealed the remarkable adaptability and resilience of shamanic traditions when faced with existential threats. Many shamanic practitioners adopted strategies of concealment that allowed them to continue their work while avoiding detection by colonial authorities. Sacred ceremonies were conducted in remote locations far from Spanish settlements, often in caves or other natural features that provided both physical concealment and spiritual significance. Ritual equipment was miniaturized and disguised to avoid recognition by Spanish inspectors, while shamanic knowledge was encoded within apparently innocuous activities such as weaving patterns, agricultural practices, and folk songs. The development of cargo cults and syncretic movements throughout Spanish colonial territories demonstrated how shamanic worldviews adapted to incorporate European elements while maintaining their essential characteristics. These movements typically emerged during periods of particular stress or upheaval, combining traditional shamanic techniques with Christian symbolism and European material culture in ways that created new forms of spiritual resistance. The cult of the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico represented perhaps the most successful example of this synthesis, incorporating Aztec goddess imagery within Christian iconography, while providing a focal point for indigenous identity that survived centuries of colonial suppression. Portuguese colonization in Brazil encountered shamanic traditions among indigenous Amazonian peoples that proved particularly resistant to European suppression efforts due to the vast geographical scale and environmental challenges of the rainforest environment. Portuguese missionaries found it virtually impossible to maintain consistent surveillance over indigenous communities scattered across thousands of square miles of dense jungle, creating opportunities for shamanic traditions to persist with minimal interference. The complex pharmacological knowledge maintained by Amazonian shamans also proved valuable to Portuguese colonists seeking treatments for tropical diseases, creating economic incentives for tolerance that complicated official suppression policies. The Jesuit reductions established throughout Portuguese and Spanish territories represented sophisticated attempts to reshape indigenous social organization in ways that would eliminate shamanic practice while maintaining indigenous labor productivity. These mission communities concentrated scattered indigenous populations in planned settlements where missionary supervision could monitor and control spiritual activities. The physical layout of reductions deliberately eliminated traditional ceremonial spaces while providing new architectural frameworks centered around Christian churches and European-style plazas. The daily schedules imposed within these communities disrupted traditional temporal rhythms and ceremonial cycles, replacing indigenous spiritual calendars with Christian liturgical observances. British colonial expansion into North America encountered indigenous shamanic traditions that had developed sophisticated diplomatic and military capabilities, requiring different suppression strategies than those employed by Spanish conquistadors. British colonists initially focused on establishing trade relationships with indigenous communities, often tolerating shamanic practices that did not directly interfere with commercial activities. However, as British settlement expanded and competition for land intensified, colonial authorities began implementing more systematic policies designed to undermine indigenous spiritual traditions and social organisation. The establishment of Indian reservations throughout British and later American territories created geographical frameworks for the systematic suppression of shamanic practices through administrative control and cultural isolation. Reservation boundaries confined indigenous peoples to limited geographical areas where their activities could be monitored and regulated by government agents specifically tasked with implementing assimilation policies. The concentration of diverse indigenous groups within single reservations deliberately disrupted traditional territorial relationships and ceremonial cycles while creating artificial social environments that undermine traditional authority structures and spiritual practices. British colonial education policies in North America explicitly targeted shamanic knowledge transmission through the establishment of boarding schools designed to remove indigenous children from their families and traditional communities during crucial developmental years. These institutions, operated by Christian denominations under government contracts, implemented comprehensive programs of cultural suppression that included prohibitions on indigenous languages, traditional dress, and any form of spiritual practice that might perpetuate shamanic traditions. Children who violated these restrictions faced severe punishments including physical beatings, solitary confinement, and public humiliation designed to create psychological associations between traditional practices and pain or shame. The Carlisle Industrial School, established in Pennsylvania in 1879, became the prototype for similar institutions throughout the United States and Canada, implementing systematic programs designed to kill the Indian and save the man through complete cultural transformation. Students at Carlisle were required to adopt European names, clothing, and behavioural patterns, while being strictly prohibited from speaking indigenous languages or practicing any traditional spiritual activities. The school's curriculum emphasised industrial training and Christian instruction, while deliberately excluding any content related to indigenous history, culture, or spiritual traditions. Canadian residential school systems, operated jointly by the federal government and various Christian denominations, implemented even more comprehensive suppression policies that continued well into the 20th century. These institutions removed indigenous children from their families for years at a time, implementing total immersion programs designed to eliminate all traces of traditional cultural knowledge. Students who attempted to maintain connections to shamanic traditions faced severe punishments, while school administrators actively sought to identify and eliminate any manifestations of traditional spiritual practice within their institutions. The Indian Act of 1876 in Canada provided legal frameworks for the comprehensive suppression of indigenous spiritual practices, explicitly prohibiting potlatch ceremonies, sun dances, and other traditional gatherings that served as focal points for shamanic activity. This legislation granted government agents broad powers to arrest and prosecute indigenous spiritual leaders, while providing legal justification for the confiscation and destruction of ceremonial objects and sacred sites. The Act also established mechanisms for the forced adoption of European legal and political systems that undermine traditional governance structures and the authority of shamanic practitioners within indigenous communities. American federal policies during the late 19th and early 20th centuries implemented similar legal frameworks through legislation such as the Religious Crimes Code, which explicitly criminalized indigenous spiritual practices and provided federal agents with authority to arrest shamanic practitioners and confiscate ceremonial materials. These laws remained in effect until 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act finally provided legal protections for indigenous spiritual practices. However, the decades of legal suppression had already caused irreparable damage to many shamanic traditions, disrupting knowledge transmission and creating gaps in ceremonial practice that proved difficult to restore. French colonial expansion into North America and other regions implemented different but equally destructive policies toward indigenous shamanic traditions, emphasizing cultural assimilation through intermarriage and economic integration, rather than the complete segregation preferred by British and Spanish colonizers. French missionaries, particularly the Jesuits, developed sophisticated strategies for undermining shamanic authority by demonstrating superior European technology and medical knowledge, while positioning Christian spiritual practices as more effective alternatives to traditional healing and ceremonial techniques. The French colonial approach to shamanic suppression often involved co-opting indigenous spiritual leaders rather than simply eliminating them, offering economic incentives and social status to shamanic practitioners who agreed to convert to Christianity and assist in the conversion of their communities. This strategy proved particularly effective because it exploited existing social hierarchies and spiritual authority structures while providing face-saving alternatives to outright resistance. Many indigenous spiritual leaders found themselves in impossible positions, forced to choose between maintaining their traditional practices in the face of overwhelming pressure or accepting conversion as a means of preserving some degree of influence within their transformed communities. Dutch colonial expansion in Indonesia, South Africa, and the Americas encountered diverse shamanic traditions that required different suppression strategies adapted to local conditions and colonial objectives. The Dutch East India Company's commercial focus initially led to relatively tolerant policies toward indigenous spiritual practices that did not interfere with trade activities. However, as Dutch territorial control expanded and competition with other European powers intensified, colonial administrators began implementing more systematic policies designed to undermine traditional authority structures and spiritual practices that might threaten Dutch hegemony. The establishment of Dutch Reformed church missions throughout colonial territories provided institutional frameworks for the systematic suppression of shamanic traditions through Christian conversion programs that emphasized the demonic nature of indigenous spiritual practices. Dutch missionaries developed detailed ethnographic knowledge of local shamanic traditions, specifically to identify and counter their influence, creating comprehensive catalogues of prohibited practices and implementing surveillance systems designed to detect and punish violations of Christian behavioral standards. Portuguese expansion into Africa encountered shamanic traditions that had developed sophisticated resistance strategies through centuries of contact with Islamic expansion and internal political upheaval. African shamanic practitioners, particularly in regions such as Angola and Mozambique, demonstrated remarkable adaptability in maintaining their spiritual technologies while accommodating external political and religious pressures. The complexity of African spiritual systems, with their elaborate hierarchies of spiritual beings and sophisticated ceremonial protocols, proved more difficult for Portuguese missionaries to comprehend and counter than the more straightforward shamanic traditions encountered in the Americas. The Atlantic slave trade created unprecedented challenges for African shamanic traditions, as millions of practitioners were forcibly transported to colonial territories in the Americas, where their spiritual practices faced systematic suppression under different colonial regimes. The survival of African shamanic elements within syncretic traditions such as Santeria, Vodou, and Candomblé demonstrated the remarkable resilience of these spiritual technologies when faced with extreme persecution. These traditions preserved essential shamanic techniques, including spirit possession, divination, and healing practices, while adapting to new geographical and cultural environments through creative synthesis with Christian and indigenous American spiritual elements. The role of anthropologists and ethnographers during the colonial period created complex dynamics that both documented shamanic traditions and contributed to their suppression through the collection and removal of ceremonial objects and sacred knowledge. Early anthropological expeditions often operated in conjunction with colonial administrative and missionary activities, providing scientific legitimacy for policies of cultural suppression while simultaneously creating detailed records of the traditions being destroyed. The establishment of museums and private collections in European and American cities resulted in the systematic removal of shamanic ritual equipment and sacred objects from their original cultural contexts, depriving indigenous communities of essential spiritual tools while enriching colonial institutions. Franz Boas and other pioneering anthropologists recognized the urgent need to document indigenous traditions that were rapidly disappearing under colonial pressure, leading to intensive fieldwork projects that created invaluable ethnographic records of shamanic practices. However, these documentation efforts often operated within colonial frameworks that viewed indigenous cultures as evolutionary relics destined for extinction rather than living traditions deserving of protection and support. The anthropological emphasis on salvage ethnography, while preserving crucial information for future generations, also reflected and reinforced colonial assumptions about the inevitable disappearance of indigenous spiritual traditions. The collection practices employed by museums and private collectors during the colonial period often involved the purchase or confiscation of sacred objects under circumstances that violated indigenous spiritual protocols and caused significant trauma to shamanic practitioners and their communities. Sacred bundles, ceremonial masks, and other ritual equipment were removed from their proper cultural contexts and displayed as curiosities or artistic objects, stripping them of their spiritual significance, while providing entertainment and education for colonial audiences. These collecting practices created lasting grievances that continue to complicate relationships between indigenous communities and academic institutions today. Government policies throughout colonial territories implemented systematic approaches to shamanic suppression that combined legal prohibition with economic pressure and social marginalization. Colonial administrators recognized that effective suppression required more than simply banning specific practices. It demanded the creation of alternative social and economic structures that would render traditional shamanic roles obsolete. The introduction of European medical systems, legal frameworks, and educational institutions provided alternative sources of healing, dispute resolution, and knowledge transmission that competed directly with shamanic services while offering apparent advantages in terms of effectiveness and social prestige. The establishment of colonial medical systems created particular challenges for shamanic healing traditions, as European-trained physicians positioned themselves as scientific alternatives to traditional healers, while colonial governments implemented licensing requirements and medical regulations that effectively criminalized shamanic therapeutic practices. The introduction of European pharmaceuticals and surgical techniques provided dramatic demonstrations of Western medical superiority in certain types of cases, undermining confidence in traditional healing methods while creating dependencies on imported medical supplies and expertise. Colonial legal systems replaced traditional dispute resolution mechanisms with European-style courts and legal procedures that eliminated shamanic practitioners' roles as mediators and judges within their communities. The imposition of written legal codes and formal judicial procedures created new categories of legal expertise that required European education and training, effectively excluding shamanic practitioners from positions of legal authority while undermining their traditional roles as interpreters of spiritual law and custom. The documentation of shamanic suppression in colonial archives provides detailed evidence of the systematic nature of these campaigns and their devastating effects on indigenous spiritual traditions. Colonial administrative records, missionary reports, and government correspondence reveal coordinated policies that targeted shamanic practitioners for elimination, while implementing comprehensive programs designed to prevent the transmission of traditional spiritual knowledge to subsequent generations. These historical sources demonstrate that shamanic suppression was not an incidental byproduct of colonial expansion, but rather a deliberate strategy designed to facilitate European political and economic control over indigenous populations. The psychological impact of shamanic suppression extended far beyond the immediate effects of prohibiting specific practices, creating profound trauma that affected entire communities and persisted across multiple generations. The systematic destruction of spiritual traditions that had provided meaning, healing, and social cohesion for thousands of years created existential crises that manifested in increased rates of suicide, alcoholism, and social dysfunction within indigenous communities. The loss of shamanic knowledge and practice created spiritual voids that colonial authorities attempted to fill with Christian alternatives, but these foreign religious systems often failed to address the specific spiritual needs and cultural orientations of indigenous peoples. The resistance strategies developed by shamanic practitioners during the colonial period demonstrated remarkable creativity and determination in preserving essential spiritual knowledge under extremely adverse conditions. Many practitioners adopted strategies of accommodation that allowed them to maintain core shamanic techniques while superficially conforming to colonial expectations. Others retreated to remote geographical areas where colonial surveillance was minimal, maintaining traditional practices in hidden locations while developing networks for the clandestine transmission of spiritual knowledge. The most successful resistance efforts often involved the creation of syncretic traditions that preserved shamanic techniques within modified cultural frameworks that appeared acceptable to colonial authorities. The vast expanse of Siberia, where shamanic traditions had flourished for millennia in relative isolation, became the primary battleground for one of the most systematic and scientifically orchestrated campaigns against shamanic practice in modern history. Stalin's consolidation of power in the Soviet Union during the 1920s brought with it an ideological framework that viewed shamanism not merely as religious superstition, but as a fundamental obstacle to the creation of a modern socialist state. The Bolshevik understanding of shamanic practitioners as representatives of feudal backwardness and class exploitation provided theoretical justification for suppression campaigns that would prove far more comprehensive and devastating than even the colonial efforts that had preceded them. The Soviet approach to shamanic suppression differed fundamentally from colonial methods in its systematic application of modern administrative techniques and scientific rationalism to the problem of eliminating traditional spiritual practices. Where colonial authorities had often relied on missionary conversion and gradual cultural transformation, Soviet planners implemented comprehensive programs that simultaneously attacked shamanic traditions through legal prohibition, economic restructuring, educational indoctrination, and physical elimination of practitioners. The state apparatus that emerged under Stalin possessed unprecedented capabilities for surveillance, control, and social engineering that enabled authorities to penetrate even the most remote Siberian communities and monitor spiritual activities with remarkable thoroughness. The collectivization campaigns of the late 1920s and early 1930s provided the initial framework for systematic shamanic suppression throughout Siberia and Central Asia. The forced consolidation of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples into collective farms and state-controlled settlements disrupted traditional seasonal migration patterns that had sustained shamanic practice for thousands of years. Reindeer herders, who had previously moved across vast territories according to ancient patterns that incorporated sacred sites and seasonal ceremonies, found themselves confined to fixed locations where their movements could be monitored and controlled by state officials. The destruction of traditional economic relationships eliminated the social structures that had supported shamanic practitioners, while creating new forms of economic dependency that made resistance increasingly difficult. Soviet ethnographers and anthropologists played crucial roles in the campaign against shamanism by providing detailed documentation of shamanic practices that enabled authorities to identify and target specific practitioners and ceremonial activities. These scholars, working under state direction, conducted extensive fieldwork throughout Siberia during the 1920s and 1930s, creating comprehensive catalogues of shamanic techniques, ritual equipment, and social organization that served as operational manuals for suppression efforts. The scientific approach to shamanic documentation represented a significant advancement over colonial methods, providing authorities with precise knowledge of shamanic practice that enabled them to develop targeted countermeasures and identify violations of state prohibitions. The legal framework established for shamanic suppression incorporated specific articles within Soviet criminal codes that defined shamanic practice as criminal activity punishable by imprisonment, exile, or execution. Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code, which addressed counter-revolutionary activities, was frequently applied to shamanic practitioners who were accused of using their spiritual authority to undermine state power and promote backward thinking among the masses. The broad language of these legal provisions enabled authorities to prosecute virtually any form of traditional spiritual activity, while providing legal justification for the confiscation of ceremonial equipment and the dissolution of shamanic societies and training systems. The implementation of anti-shamanic legislation required the establishment of specialized enforcement mechanisms that could operate effectively in the remote and challenging environments where shamanic practice persisted. Soviet authorities created networks of local informants and party officials who were specifically tasked with monitoring spiritual activities and reporting violations to central authorities. These surveillance systems proved remarkably effective in penetrating traditional communities and identifying shamanic practitioners, as economic incentives and political pressures encouraged community members to provide information about their neighbours' spiritual activities. The physical elimination of shamanic practitioners represented the most direct and devastating aspect of Soviet suppression efforts, involving the systematic arrest, imprisonment, and execution of spiritual leaders throughout Siberia and Central Asia. NKVD operations during the 1930s specifically targeted shamanic practitioners as class enemies whose influence posed fundamental threats to Soviet social transformation. The arrests often involved elaborate operations designed to capture shamans during actual ceremonial activities, providing dramatic demonstrations of state power while simultaneously gathering evidence of illegal spiritual practice that could be used in subsequent prosecutions. The destruction of shamanic ritual equipment constituted a parallel campaign that aimed to eliminate the material foundations of traditional spiritual practice. Soviet authorities organized public ceremonies where drums, costumes, sacred objects, and other shamanic implements were burned or destroyed, creating powerful symbolic demonstrations of the state's victory over traditional spiritual forces. These destruction events served multiple functions, eliminating essential tools required for shamanic practice, while providing educational opportunities where state officials could explain the scientific basis for rejecting shamanic beliefs and embracing modern socialist thinking. Educational campaigns implemented throughout Siberian communities combined anti-shamanic propaganda with broader programs of literacy and political indoctrination, designed to replace traditional worldviews with scientific materialism and socialist ideology. Soviet educators developed specific curricula that explicitly addressed shamanic beliefs and practices, providing detailed explanations of why these traditions represented backward thinking that hindered social progress and individual development. The establishment of schools in remote communities created institutional frameworks for systematic indoctrination of young people who might otherwise have been exposed to traditional shamanic knowledge and practice. The medical campaigns that accompanied educational efforts positioned Soviet healthcare as a scientific alternative to shamanic healing, providing practical demonstrations of modern medical superiority while undermining confidence in traditional therapeutic methods. Soviet medical teams conducted extensive expeditions throughout Siberia, establishing clinics and hospitals that offered free treatment using modern pharmaceuticals and surgical techniques. These medical interventions often produced dramatic results in cases where shamanic healing had proven ineffective, creating powerful evidence for the superiority of scientific medicine while discrediting shamanic practitioners' claims to healing power. The linguistic policies implemented throughout Soviet territories included systematic efforts to eliminate shamanic terminology and concepts from indigenous languages, while promoting Russian vocabulary and conceptual frameworks that supported materialist worldviews. Soviet linguists developed new writing systems for previously unwritten languages, deliberately excluding terms related to shamanic practice while incorporating extensive vocabulary related to modern technology, scientific concepts, and socialist political theory. These linguistic transformations aimed to make it increasingly difficult for traditional shamanic knowledge to be transmitted across generations while facilitating the adoption of modern scientific and political thinking. The underground preservation of shamanic knowledge during the peak years of Soviet suppression required remarkable courage and ingenuity from practitioners who risked imprisonment or death to maintain their spiritual traditions. Many shamanic practitioners adopted strategies of extreme secrecy, conducting ceremonies in remote locations far from settlements while developing coded communication systems that enabled them to coordinate spiritual activities without detection by state authorities. The most dedicated practitioners often retreated to virtually inaccessible wilderness areas where they could maintain traditional practices while remaining hidden from Soviet surveillance networks. The role of elderly shamans in preserving traditional knowledge became increasingly crucial as younger practitioners faced greater risks of detection and punishment by state authorities. These senior spiritual leaders, often too old to face the physical demands of imprisonment or exile, served as living repositories of shamanic knowledge who could continue teaching selected students, despite the extreme dangers involved. The transmission of shamanic knowledge during this period often involved abbreviated training programs that focused on essential techniques and knowledge, rather than the comprehensive education that had characterized traditional shamanic apprenticeships. The development of miniaturized and concealed ritual equipment enabled shamanic practitioners to continue their work while avoiding detection by Soviet authorities who specifically searched for traditional ceremonial implements. Practitioners created small drums that could be hidden within household items, developed portable versions of traditional costumes that could be quickly assembled and disassembled, and modified traditional ritual procedures to require minimal equipment while maintaining their essential spiritual functions. These adaptations demonstrated remarkable creativity and determination to preserve shamanic practice despite systematic state efforts to eliminate all traces of traditional spiritual activity. The network systems that developed among underground shamanic practitioners created sophisticated communication and support mechanisms that enabled isolated practitioners to maintain contact with each other and coordinate resistance activities. These networks often operated through extended family relationships and traditional clan structures that predated Soviet political organization, providing social frameworks that were difficult for state authorities to penetrate or disrupt. The most effective networks incorporated multiple levels of security and communication that enabled them to continue functioning even when individual members were arrested or eliminated by state authorities. The psychological techniques developed by shamanic practitioners to survive interrogation and imprisonment reflected sophisticated understanding of the mental strategies required to protect spiritual knowledge under extreme duress. Many practitioners developed meditation and visualization techniques that enabled them to maintain spiritual focus and protect sacred knowledge, even while enduring physical torture and psychological pressure designed to force them to reveal information about their activities and associates. These mental disciplines often incorporated traditional shamanic techniques for altering consciousness and managing pain, adapted for use in hostile environments where traditional spiritual practice was impossible. The seasonal patterns that governed underground shamanic practice required careful coordination with natural cycles and weather conditions that provided optimal opportunities for clandestine spiritual activities. Winter months often provided the best conditions for secret ceremonies, as harsh weather and reduced visibility made it difficult for state authorities to maintain surveillance over remote areas. Practitioners learned to time their activities to coincide with blizzards and other weather conditions that would mask the sounds and visual signs of ceremonial activity while making it dangerous for enforcement personnel to conduct search operations. The gradual relaxation of anti-shamanic policies during the later Stalin period and the subsequent Khrushchev era reflected changing political priorities and growing recognition that complete elimination of shamanic practice was proving more difficult and costly than originally anticipated. The massive resources required to maintain effective surveillance over the vast territories where shamanic practice persisted created administrative burdens that competed with other state priorities, while the persistent resistance of shamanic practitioners demonstrated that traditional spiritual knowledge possessed remarkable resilience and adaptability. These practical considerations, combined with evolving ideological frameworks that place greater emphasis on economic development than cultural transformation, led to gradual modifications in suppression policies that created new opportunities for shamanic survival and adaptation. The documentation efforts undertaken by Soviet ethnographers during the relaxation period created valuable records of shamanic traditions that had survived the suppression campaigns, providing insights into the remarkable adaptability and persistence of traditional spiritual knowledge under extreme adversity. These studies revealed that shamanic practice had not simply disappeared, but had instead undergone profound transformations that enabled it to persist in modified forms that were less visible to state authorities while maintaining essential spiritual functions. The ethnographic work conducted during this period provided crucial information about the survival strategies and adaptation mechanisms that had enabled shamanic traditions to endure decades of systematic persecution. The beginning of shamanic revival during the late Soviet period emerged from the intersection of relaxed enforcement policies, growing interest in indigenous cultural heritage, and the persistent underground networks that had preserved traditional knowledge throughout the suppression years. The cultural policies implemented under Brezhnev created new opportunities for the public expression of indigenous traditions, though these were carefully controlled and monitored to ensure they remained within acceptable political boundaries. The official recognition of certain indigenous cultural practices as valuable folklore and historical heritage provided protective frameworks that enabled some shamanic elements to emerge from underground while avoiding direct confrontation with state authorities. The role of academic institutions in facilitating shamanic revival created complex relationships between traditional practitioners and Soviet scholarly establishments that had previously served as instruments of suppression. Universities and research institutes began conducting ethnographic studies that treated shamanic traditions as valuable cultural heritage rather than backward superstition, providing new context for the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge. These academic frameworks enabled elderly practitioners to share their knowledge with researchers and students, while maintaining the fiction that these activities represented historical documentation rather than active spiritual practice. The emergence of cultural societies and indigenous rights organizations during the late Soviet period provided institutional frameworks that enabled shamanic practitioners to organize and coordinate their activities within acceptable political parameters. These organizations, operating under the banner of cultural preservation and ethnic heritage, created opportunities for practitioners to meet, share knowledge, and begin the process of reconstructing shamanic traditions that had been fragmented by decades of suppression. The political protection provided by official recognition enabled these groups to conduct activities that would have been impossible during the peak years of anti-shamanic persecution. The international attention that began focusing on Siberian indigenous cultures during the 1970s and 1980s created additional pressures for more tolerant policies toward traditional spiritual practices. Foreign anthropologists and cultural researchers expressed increasing interest in shamanic traditions, while international human rights organizations began documenting the suppression of indigenous spiritual practices as violations of cultural rights. These external pressures provided additional incentives for Soviet authorities to modify their policies toward shamanic practice, while demonstrating their respect for indigenous cultural heritage to international audiences. The generational challenges that emerged during the early revival period reflected the profound disruptions that decades of suppression had created in traditional knowledge transmission systems. Many potential practitioners had grown up without exposure to shamanic training, while the elderly practitioners who had preserved traditional knowledge often lacked the physical strength and social support necessary to conduct comprehensive training programs. The revival process required the development of new educational methods that could efficiently transmit essential shamanic knowledge to adult students who had missed the traditional childhood training that had characterized pre-Soviet shamanic education. The technological adaptations that began appearing during the late Soviet period demonstrated how shamanic practitioners were beginning to incorporate modern materials and techniques into their traditional practices while maintaining essential spiritual functions. This period of cautious emergence would prove to be the foundation for a remarkable transformation in how shamanic traditions would be understood, studied, and practiced in the contemporary world. The scholarly work that emerged during this transitional period would fundamentally reshape Western understanding of shamanism and provide the intellectual framework for what would become known as the neo-shamanic movement. Mircea Eliade's groundbreaking scholarly contributions to shamanic studies established the theoretical foundations that would define academic understanding of shamanism for generations. His comprehensive analysis of shamanic phenomena across diverse cultures provided the first systematic comparative framework for understanding the universal characteristics of shamanic practice, while recognizing the specific cultural adaptations that had developed in different geographical and historical contexts. Eliade's work, particularly his seminal study, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, published in 1951, synthesized decades of ethnographic research into a coherent theoretical framework that identified the core elements of shamanic practice while explaining their psychological and spiritual functions. Eliade's methodological approach to shamanic studies incorporated rigorous comparative analysis that examined shamanic traditions from Siberia, the Americas, Australia, and other regions to identify common patterns and universal characteristics. His research revealed that despite vast geographical distances and cultural differences, shamanic traditions shared fundamental techniques, including controlled trance states, soul journey experiences, communication with spiritual beings, and specialized healing practices. This comparative methodology provided scholarly legitimacy for shamanic studies while demonstrating that shamanic phenomena represented genuine spiritual technologies rather than primitive superstitions or psychological aberrations. The phenomenological framework developed by Eliade for understanding shamanic experience emphasized the importance of studying these traditions from the perspective of practitioners themselves rather than imposing external theoretical interpretations. This approach required careful attention to indigenous terminology, cosmological concepts, and experiential descriptions that reveal the internal logic and consistency of shamanic worldviews. Eliade's phenomenological method provided tools for academic researchers to study shamanic traditions with appropriate respect and understanding, while avoiding the reductionist approaches that had characterized earlier scholarly treatments of indigenous spiritual practices. Eliade's analysis of shamanic initiation experiences provided crucial insights into the psychological and spiritual processes that transformed ordinary individuals into specialized spiritual practitioners. His documentation of initiatory patterns across diverse cultures revealed consistent elements, including spiritual calling, symbolic death and rebirth, acquisition of helper spirits, and the development of specialized abilities for navigating non-ordinary reality. This comparative analysis demonstrated that shamanic initiation represented a genuine form of spiritual transformation that followed recognizable patterns regardless of cultural context, providing evidence for the universal validity of shamanic experience. The academic legitimacy that Eliade's work provided for shamanic studies created opportunities for subsequent researchers to conduct more detailed ethnographic investigations without facing the scholarly marginalization that had previously affected researchers interested in indigenous spiritual traditions. Universities began offering courses in shamanic studies, while academic journals created space for scholarly articles that treated shamanic phenomena as legitimate subjects for serious research. This institutional support enabled a generation of anthropologists, psychologists, and religious studies scholars to conduct comprehensive investigations of shamanic traditions that had survived colonial suppression and were beginning to experience revival movements. Michael Harner's practical contributions to shamanic studies complemented Eliad's theoretical work by developing systematic methods for teaching shamanic techniques to Western practitioners, while maintaining respect for traditional indigenous knowledge. Harner's background as a trained anthropologist who had conducted extensive fieldwork with shamanic practitioners in the Amazon provided him with both academic credibility and practical experience that enabled him to serve as an effective bridge between traditional shamanic cultures and contemporary Western interest in these practices. His work demonstrated that shamanic techniques could be successfully adapted for use in modern contexts while maintaining their essential spiritual effectiveness. The development of core shamanism by Harner represented a significant innovation in the transmission of shamanic knowledge, creating standardized methods for teaching fundamental shamanic techniques without appropriating specific cultural elements from particular indigenous traditions. Core shamanism focused on the universal elements of shamanic practice that appeared across diverse cultures, including drumming-induced trance states, soul journey techniques, and communication with spiritual allies. This approach enabled Western practitioners to learn authentic shamanic methods while avoiding the cultural appropriation issues that arose when specific tribal practices were adopted outside their original cultural contexts. Harner's establishment of the Foundation for Shamanic Studies in 1979 provided institutional frameworks for the systematic teaching and research of shamanic techniques in contemporary settings. The Foundation developed training programs that taught core shamanic methods to healthcare professionals, therapists, and other practitioners who sought to incorporate shamanic healing techniques into their professional work. These educational initiatives demonstrated the practical applications of shamanic knowledge in addressing contemporary health and social problems, while maintaining academic standards and respect for traditional indigenous wisdom. The research programs sponsored by the Foundation for Shamanic Studies created opportunities for systematic investigation of shamanic healing effectiveness using modern scientific methodologies. These studies examined the physiological and psychological effects of shamanic healing techniques, documenting measurable improvements in various health conditions following shamanic treatment. The scientific validation of shamanic healing effectiveness provided evidence that these traditional practices possessed genuine therapeutic value that could complement conventional medical approaches while offering unique benefits not available through purely biomedical interventions. The emergence of neo-shamanism in Western societies during the 1960s and 1970s reflected broader cultural movements that questioned conventional religious and medical approaches while seeking more direct and experiential forms of spiritual practice. The counterculture movements of this period created social environments that were receptive to alternative spiritual practices, while growing awareness of environmental destruction generated interest in indigenous worldviews that emphasized harmony between human communities and natural ecosystems. Neo-shamanic practitioners sought to adapt traditional shamanic techniques for use in contemporary contexts, while addressing the spiritual and healing needs of modern urban populations. The integration of shamanic techniques with psychotherapy and counseling created innovative therapeutic approaches that combine traditional healing methods with modern psychological understanding. Therapists trained in shamanic techniques began incorporating soul retrieval, power animal work, and other shamanic methods into their clinical practice, often achieving remarkable results with clients who had not responded well to conventional therapeutic approaches. These integrative methods demonstrated the compatibility between shamanic healing and modern psychology while providing evidence for the effectiveness of traditional spiritual techniques in addressing contemporary mental health challenges. The development of shamanic counseling as a distinct therapeutic modality required careful attention to ethical considerations and professional standards that ensured responsible practice while maintaining the integrity of traditional shamanic knowledge. Practitioners developed training programs that combined shamanic technique instruction with professional counseling education, creating qualified therapists who could safely and effectively integrate shamanic methods into their clinical work. These programs emphasized the importance of cultural sensitivity and respect for indigenous traditions while providing practical skills for adapting shamanic techniques to contemporary therapeutic contexts. The revival of traditional shamanic practices among indigenous communities following political and cultural liberation movements created opportunities for the restoration of spiritual traditions that had been suppressed for decades or centuries. The civil rights movements of the 1960s and subsequent indigenous rights activism provided political frameworks that enabled native communities to reclaim their traditional spiritual practices while demanding legal protections for their religious freedom. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 provided crucial legal protections that enabled Native American communities to practice their traditional ceremonies without fear of government persecution. The process of cultural revitalization among indigenous communities required careful reconstruction of shamanic traditions that had been disrupted by colonial suppression and forced assimilation policies. Elderly practitioners who had preserved traditional knowledge during the suppression years served as teachers for younger community members who sought to reconnect with their spiritual heritage. These revitalization efforts often involved the recovery of ceremonial objects from museums and private collections, the restoration of sacred sites that had been damaged or desecrated, and the re-establishment of training systems that could effectively transmit traditional knowledge to new generations of practitioners. The role of indigenous shamanic practitioners in contemporary healing and social services demonstrated the continued relevance of traditional spiritual technologies in addressing modern community problems. Native American reservations and other indigenous communities began integrating traditional healing methods with conventional healthcare systems, creating comprehensive treatment programs that addressed both physical and spiritual aspects of illness and social dysfunction. These integrated approaches often proved more effective than purely biomedical treatments in addressing health problems that were rooted in cultural disruption and spiritual disconnection. The challenges of cultural appropriation versus authentic preservation created ongoing debates within modern shamanic communities regarding the proper boundaries between legitimate spiritual practice and exploitative commercialization of indigenous traditions. Indigenous practitioners and their allies raised concerns about the unauthorized use of specific tribal ceremonies, sacred symbols, and spiritual techniques by non-indigenous practitioners who lacked proper training and cultural understanding. These concerns led to the development of ethical guidelines and educational programs designed to promote respectful engagement with shamanic traditions while preventing harmful appropriation of sacred knowledge. The emergence of plastic shamanism as a commercial phenomenon highlighted the potential for exploitation and misrepresentation of authentic shamanic traditions by practitioners who prioritized profit over spiritual integrity. Plastic shamans typically offered simplified versions of traditional ceremonies and healing techniques without proper training or cultural authorization, often charging substantial fees for services that were traditionally provided as community obligations rather than commercial transactions. The proliferation of plastic shamanism created confusion about authentic practice, while potentially causing harm to participants who received inadequate or inappropriate spiritual treatment. The development of ethical standards for contemporary shamanic practice required collaboration between indigenous practitioners, academic researchers, and neo-shamanic practitioners to establish guidelines that protected traditional knowledge while enabling appropriate adaptation for contemporary contexts. These standards emphasize the importance of proper training, cultural sensitivity, and ongoing relationship with traditional knowledge holders as prerequisites for legitimate shamanic practice. Educational programs were developed to teach practitioners about the cultural contexts and spiritual responsibilities associated with shamanic work while providing practical guidance for avoiding appropriative practices. Contemporary shamanic healing practices have demonstrated remarkable effectiveness in addressing a wide range of health conditions that often prove resistant to conventional medical treatment. Soul retrieval techniques have proven particularly valuable in treating trauma-related disorders, helping clients recover psychological wholeness following experiences of abuse, violence, or severe loss. Power animal retrieval and spiritual extraction methods have shown success in addressing chronic pain conditions, autoimmune disorders, and other health problems that appear to have spiritual as well as physical components. These healing modalities often work most effectively when integrated with conventional medical care rather than used as complete alternatives to biomedical treatment. The integration of shamanic healing with modern therapeutic approaches has created innovative treatment programs that combine the best elements of traditional spiritual healing with contemporary psychological and medical knowledge. Hospitals and treatment centers have begun incorporating shamanic practitioners into their healthcare teams, recognizing that traditional healing methods can provide valuable complementary services that enhance overall treatment effectiveness. These integrated programs often focus on addressing the spiritual and emotional aspects of illness that may not be adequately treated through purely biomedical approaches. The training requirements for contemporary shamanic practitioners have evolved to include both traditional apprenticeship methods and modern educational standards that ensure competent and ethical practice. Training programs typically combine intensive experiential learning of shamanic techniques with academic study of indigenous cultures, healing methodologies, and professional ethics. Many programs require extensive supervised practice and ongoing mentorship relationships that ensure practitioners develop both technical competence and spiritual maturity before working independently with clients. The scientific research that has emerged around shamanic healing practices has provided valuable insights into the mechanisms through which these traditional techniques achieve their therapeutic effects. Neurological studies of shamanic trance states have revealed specific brainwave patterns and neurochemical changes that appear to facilitate healing and psychological integration. Research on the placebo effect and the role of belief in healing has demonstrated that the spiritual frameworks provided by shamanic practice can enhance the body's natural healing capabilities while providing psychological benefits that support recovery from illness and trauma. The technological adaptations that have emerged in contemporary shamanic practice demonstrate how traditional techniques can be enhanced and preserved through modern innovations while maintaining their essential spiritual functions. Digital recording technology has enabled the preservation of traditional songs, ceremonies, and oral teachings that might otherwise be lost as elderly practitioners pass away. Online education platforms have created new opportunities for the transmission of shamanic knowledge, while enabling practitioners from different geographical regions to share techniques and collaborate on healing projects. The global networking that has developed among contemporary shamanic practitioners has created unprecedented opportunities for cross-cultural exchange and mutual learning between traditional indigenous practitioners and neo-shamanic communities. International conferences and workshops bring together practitioners from diverse backgrounds to share techniques, discuss ethical issues, and collaborate on research projects that advance understanding of shamanic healing methods. These networks have also facilitated support for indigenous communities seeking to revitalize their traditional practices, while providing resources for the protection of sacred sites and ceremonial objects. The environmental activism that has emerged from contemporary shamanic communities reflects the ecological consciousness that is fundamental to traditional shamanic worldviews. Shamanic practitioners have become prominent advocates for environmental protection, drawing on their spiritual understanding of the interconnectedness between human communities and natural ecosystems to promote sustainable living practices and resistance to environmental destruction. These activism efforts often combine traditional ceremonial approaches with modern political organizing to create powerful movements for environmental justice and ecological restoration. The future challenges facing contemporary shamanic practice include the need to maintain authentic connections to traditional knowledge while adapting to rapidly changing social and technological environments. Climate change, urbanization, and cultural globalization create new contexts that require innovative approaches to shamanic practice, while preserving the essential spiritual technologies that have sustained human communities for millennia. The ongoing dialogue between traditional practitioners and contemporary adaptations will continue to shape the evolution of shamanic practice as it addresses the spiritual and healing needs of an increasingly complex and interconnected world. The remarkable journey of shamanic traditions from their ancient origins in Paleolithic caves to their contemporary revival in modern therapeutic settings demonstrates the enduring power and relevance of these fundamental human spiritual technologies. Despite centuries of suppression, persecution, and cultural disruption, shamanic knowledge has proven remarkably resilient, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining its essential characteristics as a system for healing, spiritual guidance, and community support. The scholarly foundation provided by researchers like Mircea Eliade and the practical innovations developed by practitioners like Michael Harner have created frameworks that enable shamanic wisdom to contribute meaningfully to contemporary life while honouring the indigenous traditions from which this knowledge emerged. As humanity faces unprecedented global challenges requiring both spiritual wisdom and practical innovation, the shamanic understanding of interconnectedness, healing, and harmony between human communities and the natural world offers essential guidance for creating sustainable and spiritually fulfilling approaches to modern existence.